Okay, before we begin with this workshop, just a couple of disclaimers at the top, 5 to be exact. The first is just things that I'm not going to talk about in this workshop, just a couple of things I want to get out of the way. The first is this is primarily focusing on long-term relationships and the effect on more serious relationships within given debate motions, and so I'm not going to really discuss all that much, although I will mention dating apps and go into dating apps in some detail. But I'm not going to talk that much about arguments with regards to the sort of motions that sometimes arise around hookup culture and that sort of thing. Second, I'm also not going to talk about media depictions of love. We'll get there in the media section, but not something I'm planning to go over right now. And third, I'm also not going to talk about the sort of choose-your-own-adventure relationship motions that come up. So things like this house as Odysseus would stay on Calypso's island, this house as Jordan would object to the marriage, this house would stay in a committed monogamous relationship with the worm, etc. These are all very fun motions. And you probably can use, in fact, I think in all of those settings, the motions I've talked about so far, you can use some of the takeaways from this workshop, but especially these ones, they're highly specific and they're a little less connected to sort of relationship dynamics, which will be the primary focus of this workshop. We will, however, cover these in practice possibly, so be prepared for that. 3 other disclaimers. First, none of the things that I say here are my personal opinion. They're not representative of my past experiences. They are just things that can be used for debate. Second, this is not relationship advice. And the final thing is just content warning. We will talk about abusive relationships inside of this topic area. It will be somewhat brief because, we'll talk about that when we get to it. Okay. There are 2 sorts of technical things that it is good to have familiarity with for debates in regards to relationships. The first is marriage, prenuptials, and divorce. Specifically, I'm going to give you a basis for approaching all of those things that is very US-centric, but some of the principles and broader stuff you can kind of cast out past just the US as well. So marriage is a civil legal status. It requires you have the capacity to marry, mutual consent and compliance with the state's formalities, so a license, vows, etc., depending on what the states require. Primarily, marriage is governed by state law. However, it does have federal importance. First thing that it has federal importance for is tax filing. Very obviously, you file your taxes, your federal taxes, differently if it is the case that you are married. It also just gives you a large list of benefits where marital status is considered as a factor. So, for example, estate planning, you can transfer unlimited assets without gift taxes to someone you're married to. Spouses are typically allowed to be added to employee benefits and stuff like that. So there's a large list of benefits, of financial benefits that come from being married. However, the majority of the stuff surrounding it is governed by state law. Additionally, religious and social norms are deeply ingrained in marital institutions. So in the US, while ceremonies have no real legal status and laws are decided by the state and federal government rather than religious bodies, this is not true in every part of the world. Many countries adopt a mixed legal regime. So, for example, India has religion-specific personal laws and also a secular civil marriage route across religion or caste lines. Many other countries primarily recognize religious or customary marriage. So, for example, Israel, where marriage and divorce are typically handled through religious authorities. People who don't want to do that typically have to get married abroad and then seek registration inside of Israel. Some countries recognize civil unions as a less socially loaded and sometimes legally different alternative to marriage. So I believe EU competencies require that, but this, I don't know if that's for sure the case. I believe it is, but it's definitely the case in a lot of European states that in many instances they offer civil unions as an alternative to marriage. Polygynous marriage, while it is not recognized in the US, is frequently legal as well. Generally, this is one man with multiple wives. Divorce. Divorce begins when one spouse files a petition or a complaint in a court. The other spouse is then, quote-unquote, served. Divorce proceedings in the US typically determine the following things. First, how property and debts are divided. Second, whether either spouse owes continuing support to the other. And third, parental rights or responsibilities for children. On property and debt division, most states distinguish between community and separate property. States differ, but separate property generally includes property owned before marriage, gifts, inheritances that were kept separate via prenuptials or just based on the inheritance stipulations. Marital property generally includes any earned assets that were acquired during marriage. Some states use community property rules. So, for example, Arizona, California, Texas, Washington, New Mexico, and a couple of others, where spouses are treated as equally sharing community property. Most other states, and most states in general, use equitable distribution. So courts divide community property in a way that is deemed fair by the court. Debt is also divided at the point of divorce. Children. Courts distinguish 4 things with regards to children. First, legal custody, that is, who has the decision-making authority, so decisions like medical care, mental health treatment, etc. The default and most common arrangement is joint legal custody, so one parent cannot independently change the child's school, for example. In highly conflictual divorces, joint legal custody is frequently a continuance governance dispute, which takes time and money from both parents and the child, as parents frequently return to court over small things like vaccination decisions, therapy, sports participation, relocation, etc. So courts generally reject this model when parental conflict looks as though it will likely be extreme, opting for sole legal custody, where one parent has primary authority as a decision maker, but the other parent still gets information and maintains visitation rights. Second, physical custody is decided, so that is where the child lives. Third, visitation rights. Fourth, any owed child support. And additionally, modern US family law prioritizes the best interests of the child. This is a change from the family law regime a while ago. Because divorce generally takes months and sometimes years, the court frequently uses temporary orders to decide things like who stays in the home, who pays the bills, who has temporary custody of children, and to protect spouses in instances where allegations of domestic violence exist before the court can ensure whether or not these allegations are true. Contested divorces require far more court time. Frequently, they require the hiring of experts, and they're generally far more expensive than uncontested divorces, where both figures agree generally on splitting up and splitting assets or liabilities. When figures own hard to evaluate assets, so for example, a business, there can be valuation disputes, which are frequently also very expensive. Similarly, children sharply increase costs because custody litigation is fact-intensive and frequently very emotionally intense for both figures, because obviously you are deeply emotionally invested in your child. Divorce can frequently be weaponized in abusive relationships in the lead up and during the divorce proceedings. If one figure has a monetary advantage such that they can afford a war of attrition for far longer than the other figure, this can act as a bar to divorce in the first place, and it can make divorce ruinous for the disadvantaged figure. It's worth noting that most states allow judges to order one spouse to contribute to the other's legal fees, especially when there is a major income disparity or one party is acting particularly maliciously, so for example, needlessly prolonging litigation. It's also worth noting, however, that most people are not particularly legally fluent and may well not know this in the lead up and during the divorce proceedings, although during the divorce proceedings frequently you do figure out this sort of thing because you have a lawyer involved and that sort of stuff. Even when it's not being weaponized, divorce can be financially ruinous for one or both parties. People frequently spend very large sums of time and money litigating over issues which have a very, very small objective value. Why might people make irrational decisions like this? Well, divorce is frequently intensely emotionally charged. It involves betrayal. It involves your perceived status. It involves lots and lots of humiliation, fear, and potentially even wants for revenge against your partner. Divorce itself, as a result of all of this, is intensely psychologically draining and frequently very traumatic for people who undergo it. Knowing that divorce is frequently very expensive, on average costing $12,000 to $17,000, and realizing that it confers many financial benefits, many people nominally get divorced while still being legally married. So divorce rates as a result are somewhat underreported. Despite this, in the United States, 41% of first marriages end in divorce, 60% of second marriages, and 73% of third marriages. So why are divorce rates so high? One reason is just that divorces become more accessible over time, both mentally and legally. You no longer have to prove cause to get divorced. You can be more certain of a more fair division of assets, etc. Second, marriage has shifted over time. In many older marital systems, marriage was deeply anchored by necessity, religious obligation, and a lack of social mobility, and also a far more intense social pressure to stay in the relationship. Existing expectations have far more to do with a fulfillment of your higher order needs. So for example, intimacy, sexual compatibility, etc. And our needs are not static things. So you change immensely over the course of even 10 years. This lack of existential pressure paired with an emphasis on ever-changing attributes means that divorce has just become far more common and normal. Prenups. What are prenups? Prenups are contracts that two marrying people sign prior to marriage, which predetermines, subject to contract law. If you want to read about contract law, see a document that I've linked. But it predetermines what counts as marital property, how assets and liabilities are allocated, and whether spousal support is owed. The most common functions are protecting premarital assets, protecting family wealth or inheritances, and preserving your business ownership. Prenups are only enforceable if a number of conditions are satisfied, and a lot of these extend pretty directly from contract law. So again, read up on that document if you want to learn more about these. But first is just voluntary entry. So for example, prenups cannot be presented mere days before a wedding because that puts intense pressure on you to sign the prenup. Publicly threatening cancellation if a prenup isn't signed generally renders it void. Again, that feels as though you're being pressured into signing the prenup. There must also be full financial disclosure, so both parties must know the full financial situation of their counterpart at the point that they decide to enter into a prenup. And the agreement cannot be unconscionable. So, and this is somewhat of a up to the court standard, although obviously it has a vast legal doctrine that stands behind it and decides where that is, but unconscionable by itself doesn't mean all that much. Just, for example, one spouse lacked legal counsel, or enforcement would produce destitution for one spouse, or instances in which it might be deemed an unconscionable agreement to follow through on, or unconscionable in design. It's worth saying that prenups do not only matter for the ultra-rich. Frequently they are used by middle-class couples around things like student debt, family homes, retirement accounts, or stipulations with regards to children from prior relationships. They can be a source of stability for relationships where there may otherwise be concerns about things like future inheritance disputes, and in good faith they make the divorce process much smoother if it has to occur in the first place. Since prenups require full financial disclosure, they can frequently just be good as conversation starters about fiscal planning and as creating forced financial transparency between partners. Plausibly, given that prenups are frequently signed at a healthy point in the relationship, they protect disadvantaged partners from being strong-armed in court proceedings at the point that the relationship has turned against them. However, prenups rarely get rid of litigation risk. Very frequently, couples still have litigation wars over interpretation, whether or not the prenup is legitimate in the first place, or whether the circumstances have changed dramatically in a way that nullifies considerations. We'll talk about this a bit later, but it's also worth noting that prenups are generally signed at the height of the honeymoon phase, where power imbalances are particularly emphasized, and people are likely to not consider long-term ramifications on them, given that they just are over the moon for their partner. They want to do as much as possible for them. The second technical thing that you should have a grip on for relationships debates are just dating apps. These come up every once in a while. Dating app algorithms look to optimize engagement. Why does engagement matter for dating apps? 3 primary reasons. First, the more engaged that you are, the more you contribute data to improving the recommendation system that the dating app uses. Second, a completely disengaged user is just unlikely to make in-app purchases, to upgrade their subscription, etc. And third, many dating apps rely on advertisement revenue, as you probably know, and engagement increases the number of ads that you run into. So as a result, dating apps have somewhat paradoxical incentives. Users try to use them with the hopes of not using them because they want to get off of the dating app and have a long and fulfilling relationship, yet dating apps want to keep users on them for as long and as much as possible. How do algorithms optimize for engagement? First, users explicitly narrow their pool of candidates. For example, age range, gender, sexuality, distance, religion in some instances, lifestyle preferences, etc. Second, historically, some apps used ELO systems. So, for example, early Tinder users who received the most right swipes were ranked higher, effectively chess ELO-like, allowing the system to rank desirability. And as a result, those users saw their profiles shown to more people. Currently, systems rely far more on machine learning recommendation models, which infer behavior from data such as A, who you swipe on, how quickly you swipe on them, who swipes on you, who replies, how long conversations last, whether phone numbers get exchanged, whether dates are likely, whether users remain active afterward, and a large host of other things that data can be tracked from. Apps then build a behavioral profile of you, which decides how often you get recommended to people, which people you get recommended to, and who gets recommended to you. For example, if you consistently linger on profiles with outdoorsy pictures, you'll probably get recommended more of those. This creates a sort of desirability stratification, where highly desirable users get more visibility in matches, while low desirability users may receive less exposure or be shown primarily to one another. Rather obviously, apps also have strong incentives to not make low desirability users feel completely hopeless, as they'll eventually give up and leave the platform if that's the case. So sometimes platforms boost particularly desirable users to be seen by people who are likely to never be matches for them, just to increase engagement. Okay, that's all on the sort of technical things that are involved in these debates. Let's talk about some relationship dynamics. First, let's go over all of the ways that relationships can be good for you. One, you have someone who deeply understands you. You feel that you can be open to them. You have a large sum of shared experiences. You share your emotions, your deep thoughts, your worries with them. Your happiness compounds with theirs. Your sadness feels less sad because you can process and be told that things are all right. In the instances that you don't share, this acts as a sharing of its own. Your partner is used to you sharing, and therefore they ask you what's wrong. You're given the opportunity to share things that you otherwise wouldn't with people who are not as aware of your sort of tendencies there. It is also just good to have someone who you can be vulnerable to help you through the hardest decisions in life, to comfort you when you feel like you're worrying over nothing, to share the small aspects of your life with, the things that make you happy on a day-to-day basis. We all want to be heard, and it's amazing to know for certain that you have someone who cares and will always listen to you. Vulnerability itself leads to reciprocated vulnerability. They feel safer, and so they do the same for you. Frequently, this sort of intimacy can align your expectations with your partner. So, for example, maybe your partner doesn't feel shut out because they have an expectation that they haven't felt as though they had the safe space to disclose, or vice versa. And this provides you with a deeper knowledge of each other, the needs that you might have that you think are silly that they might adjust to because they care about you. You trust each other deeply, which builds confidence in the relationship. Additionally, self-acceptance just becomes considerably easier when someone else accepts you. Talking through things instead of bottling them up is obviously far better. And there are many things that you only feel comfortable talking through with your partner. And so frequently there are a lot of conversations that are exclusively ones that you can hold if you're in a relationship with someone who you deeply trust and are willing to have these conversations with. Finally, you also feel seen and understood, which just fulfills a basic psychological need of most humans. Second, relationships provide a physical sense of security. You can take career risks with work while knowing that you have emotional and financial support. Moving to a new place feels less overwhelming, even if they don't move with you, because you know that you can talk through all of the difficulties that you run into during that. But presumably, if they do move with you, then very clearly that is considerably less overwhelming because you have someone else who you are comfortable with already there helping you out the entire time. You always know that you have a shoulder to cry on, etc. Third, they give you a sense of meaning and importance, so you're someone else's go-to person, someone else is your go-to person. Early life is rather linear, so you go to high school, you go to college, you get a job, but later life frequently loses that sense of linearity. Many professions are low mobility, jobs stall out for long periods of time, and relationships do fix this. So you hit certain anniversaries, you might get engaged, you might get married, you might have kids, your kids might hit landmark ages, your kids might follow the sort of school to college to job path, which adds milestone events to your personal life. You can build a family with them, which gives you meaning regardless of whether or not you hit these milestone events, because you have other people who you see as continuances of yourself. Obviously, additionally, being in a relationship gives you access to physical intimacy, so sex very obviously, but also just human touch, so hugs, someone to run their hand through your hair, etc., which is frequently quite difficult to get from other places because it is generally stigmatized in a large number of social settings. Fifth, they give you financial stability and benefits. So tax breaks obviously in the instance of being married, but also just lower rent and utilities and fixed living costs. So for example, pots and pans type shit. Second, why might a relationship be bad for you? The first reason is just that you're constantly around your partner, and so while this frequently is good for you because it gives you shared life experiences, on the flip side it can also be quite bad because annoying things build up over time. Their infuriating habits start to get on your nerves over time in a way that they don't over a short period. You have no time to cool off after they bug you, and as a result, it is very easy to induce spirals of negativity because you're around each other constantly, because you cannot take as much space as you need to cool off and then have conversations that are important, because the small things that they do that annoy you build up over time to the point where you hit a breaking point and you lash out against them, or you hold a conversation that is somewhat at odds with one another instead of trying to resolve the thing, and that spirals and they feel upset, etc. Second, as much as you open yourself up to intense positivity, you also open yourself up to deep heartbreak and emotional trauma at the point that the relationship falls through. Maybe your partner dies, maybe something horrific happens, and you are emotionally traumatized for the rest of your life. And the feelings that we can feel here are particularly intense in many instances. Third, you just expend lots of emotional energy. You care about the things that your partner does, about their emotions, about their wants. All of these weigh on you deeply. You feel bad when they are unfulfilled, and you feel even worse when you contributed to the fact that they feel unfulfilled, or them being disappointed because you didn't do something that you meant to do, or that you didn't know they expected you to do. Couples fight, even in healthy relationships, and frequently those fights are intensely emotionally exhaustive because you each care immensely about one another, and yet you have this sort of thing that you cannot come to terms over quite easily, and it is genuinely quite emotionally difficult to go through that. The more time and emotional intimacy that you invest in a relationship, the more a potential breakup feels potentially devastating and weighs on you prior to it happening. In any instance where you feel like your partner might be considerate or considering it, or in any instance where it just happens to come to mind for you, for example, you feel that you always have to be there for them, which leads to, in many instances, just emotional burnout, especially when you don't have the emotional capacity to always be their support person in every instance where they need support, yet you feel like you have to be there because you are the person who is supposed to be there. Small mistakes that you make in the context of the relationship, so for example, things like forgetting about a special day or just double scheduling, have a huge weight to them because they can affect the entirety of the relationship. Fourth, there's just a very real opportunity cost, so you lose out on sexual or romantic experimentation because it is genuinely somewhat difficult to experiment with your partner in many instances. It is quite difficult to broach vulnerable and judgment-ridden conversations about things that are maybe stigmatized with someone whose perspective of you matters so intensely and deeply to you, and literally does matter in the sense that their perspective of you is probably physically important to you. Additionally, your independence in life planning goes out the window. You cannot do things like uproot your life on a whim, take job opportunities that are halfway across the country that you live in without consulting someone who will be deeply affected by them. You can't make high-risk, high-reward choices at work. You cannot make big purchases on things that you might want to make big purchases on. Also, if sex or physicality becomes a chore, that, like, for example, maybe you aren't really into it, you feel as if it is just something that is expected, or is something that your partner will be upset about if you don't, or you're just afraid of them feeling as though you're falling out of love, and therefore you force yourself to do these sorts of things. In many instances, this one leads to you losing out on the base psychological need that you were getting access to in the first place. B, frequently you feel irritated by the things that you have to do in a way that you feel that you cannot tell them because you don't want them to feel as though you're falling out of love with them, which builds up immensely over time. And C, given that most relationships are pretty exclusive, you frequently cannot get this need met somewhere else. The fifth thing is just that frequently relationships lead to dependence, that is both financially in the sense that oftentimes you end up with joint finances, or financial dependence because of career sacrifices or lower earnings that one partner has to take on, or just emotionally to the extent that you isolate yourself from your friends because it is just far easier to share things with this one person who knows you so closely, who it is natural to talk to, etc. And therefore you become reliant on them emotionally and develop emotional dependence over time. Why might we enter relationships? One reason is just a fear of loneliness. It is somewhat sad to be by yourself, especially if you've been in a committed relationship before. You see your friends in happy or happy-looking relationships. You miss or want the intimacy. It is difficult to not have someone who you can process your deepest feelings to. Second, sex, obviously. Sex is a basic psychological driver for rather obvious evolutionary reasons. It is highly glorified in the media. It releases chemicals that make you feel indescribably good, and also just have other health benefits like promoting deeper sleep. Third, relationships are intensely romanticized by media, by your friends, and the stories that your family tells you. You perceive only the best portion of other people's relationships. So, for example, the things they post on Instagram, the portions that make their way into conversations in later life. Fourth, there are just strong social and evolutionary pressures to form a family, and very obviously this is a precursor. The reason that I'm going over all of this is just because many relationships debates ask you to make a trade-off between relationships and other things. So, for example, this house opposes the narrative that love is about sacrifice, or this house supports the norm of prioritizing one's career over things like forming a family and young adult life, etc. This gives you analysis to paint relationships out as good or bad. As a tip, Do weighing against the other side, acknowledging their strengths, and explaining why you still went out over them. It also may be strategic in some relationships debates, which appear to have a trade-off in the number of people who are getting into relationships to marginalize that trade-off in the first place. Let's talk about the 3 stages of relationships, that is, entering relationships, the broad length of relationships that happens in between entering and exiting relationships. Entering relationships first. There are lots of good reasons that you fall in love. Maybe it is that your partner gives you a unique feeling of safety and security. Maybe they are uniquely attuned to and adept at fulfilling your needs. Maybe you just have so many cherished shared memories prior to the relationship that you slowly fall for each other. There are also lots of bad reasons that we may fall in love. So you may not actually fall in love with your partner, but rather how your partner admires or sees you, how they boost your self-esteem. You may fall in love with a mentally idealized version of your partner. You may fall in love because of a desire to master previous negative situations. So for example, maybe you had distant parents or a distant previous relationship, and you want the chance to feel as though you are winning in that past context by finding and fixing a relationship with a new distant person. Maybe it is just that we feel safe in situations that are familiar to us. So you know what it is like for this to be the case. You've developed defense mechanisms. It aligns with your personal sense of self. Maybe if your parents were distant or abusive in some way, you're as a result drawn to the same sort of relationships just out of a simple sense of security because you know what it is like to be in them. Maybe you don't believe that you're lovable in the first place. You don't pursue good and healthy relationships. Maybe you're just bored or lonely and you desire drama. Maybe it's that you have a savior complex, so maybe you date addicts because you want to be the one who stops their addiction. Maybe you feel emotionally devastated from a recent breakup and you re-enter the dating market too quickly to avoid those feelings, to have someone that you can just move forward with without reflecting on the hurt that you feel in the present. So these are all reasons that you can fall in love with someone, regardless of whether or not it is good or bad. Let's talk about a number of characteristics that define this stage of a relationship. First, you have highly limited information. So it is frequently taboo to have horribly deep conversations when you first meet someone as to the sorts of things that you want to get out of the relationship, the sorts of deal breakers that might come up in the future, and that sort of thing. You just want to present a sort of best version of yourself, and so maybe there are red flags that you have that you try to keep hidden under the table during the first few dates that you go on or something like this. You don't know how it is that you will solve conflict together when conflict arises, so you just have a lack of information as to how you will work through things with your partner. You don't know each other's tendencies, you don't know each other's trauma, etc. Second, the relationship is fun, it is exciting, it is new. Even in rebound relationships, frequently, relationships get stale or worse towards the end. So, for example, maybe sex isn't as fun because in the back of your mind, you're concerned about the potentiality of breaking up. People preemptively emotionally distance themselves. Physical touch takes on different connotations or gets old. This is a new person that you get to figure out. Someone with new intricacies. Their hands feel different. They have different habits. They have different quirks, etc. The novelty itself is exciting, and as a result, your judgment is impaired. You want it to work out. You want to be optimistic about it, and you see and experience only the best parts of your partner, again, because these are frequently the parts that they bring to the table at the start of relationships. And you observe all of this with rose-colored glasses, so even if there are red flags, you probably ignore them. Love is felt most intensely during this period, compounded by uncertainty and excite regarding the new relationship. And as a result, you're very willing to overlook the sorts of negative interactions that might occur. So, for example, maybe they make you jealous in some instances. Maybe there are toxic interactions, but you write these off as things that are infrequent, unimportant, because you are so excited and uncertain about the future with them. Third, this stage of the relationship is just characterized by you starting to make trade-offs, which kind of snowball over time. So you spend less time around your friends. As your partner takes up more of your time, you have to adjust to making decisions with them included in the thought process, etc. Second stage, during the relationship. What are the primary characteristics that define this stage of the relationship? First, the original excitement of the relationship fades into routinity. And this can plausibly lead to disillusionment and tension as the thrill of the start of something new somewhat fades away. And it is just true that sometimes people are primarily in love with that feeling and not with each other. But in many instances, this is just fine. You move past it and you realize that this is the natural course of the relationship. Second, the depth of commitment increases. So you accumulate shared experiences. Your partner brings you lots and lots of comfort. The relationship becomes your new normal. You invest time, emotional bandwidth, and money into each other over time. Third, this is a stage where large obstacles can appear, both in the sense that small things compile over time, and in the sense that maybe differences in relationship aspirations begin to make their way into the available pool of knowledge for both partners here. Or maybe one partner just has to choose between sacrificing major opportunities or potentially imperiling the relationship. Fourth, it both becomes harder and easier to communicate at the same time, so you grow accustomed to and comfortable with one another. Conversations become more fluid. You realize what each other does when they are hurting and don't want to let the other person know. And at the same time, however, since everything is routinized, there's inertia in the way of communicating any want for change. It becomes difficult to express a want for more excitement in your life, yet this is directly as these things build up and take their emotional toll on you, which means that proper communication in these contexts is particularly important, because if you cannot communicate properly with your partner, these sorts of things will just boil up and flow over eventually. The final stage of the relationship, leaving the relationship. Why might relationships fail? This is obviously a non-exhaustive list, and I should have flagged this for the entering into relationships. Both of those were very obviously non-exhaustive as well. First, it's just maybe there is a fundamental incompatibility between your wants. So, for example, maybe you want to get married and your partner doesn't. Maybe you want kids, your partner knows that they do not want kids. Maybe it is the case that a breach of trust occurs, so maybe your partner cheats on you. Maybe your life circumstances get in the way, so maybe you just need to move away from one another and don't want to undergo the difficulties of long-distance relationships. Failures of communication can also lead to this sort of thing. So, for example, different love languages or needs. Frequently, it is difficult to ask your partner for what you need from them because you feel as though it is an imposition. You feel a little grieved that they haven't already recognized this as a need, and you probably have done small things to indicate as such that you feel should be obvious to them. And as a result, two people can genuinely put a lot of work into prioritizing one another in a relationship, but never notice it because their love languages don't match up, or they're prioritizing the wrong things, and feel, as a result, underappreciated. Additionally, most people model their understanding of serious relationships off of their most proximate experience of serious long-term relationships. For some, this is a past relationship, but for most people, this is your parents' relationship. You believe that what your parents did is normal, but parents have very different relationships, and as a result, you can frequently have silent differences in expectations for how you should approach them. There are any number of other hidden expectations that can also just come up that can frequently ruin relationships. These are obviously rather minor examples of it, and frequently it looks like a lot of these occurring over a period of time and having bad communication tactics or not understanding yourself to the extent that you realize that these are hidden expectations. But for example, it might look like one partner valuing Valentine's Day and another partner not. It might look like one partner caring intensely about their birthday being a particular way and the other partner failing to fulfill that. Or it might look like just not understanding how each other wants to divide work, etc. For the record, this is why things like therapy are very, very important in even healthy relationships, because they facilitate the necessary conversations to avoid downward spirals, and they also give you access to someone who can very much dig deep into you personally in a way that you frequently cannot do. Some characteristics of this phase. The primary thing to say is just that leaving relationships is intensely difficult and painful, and that is regardless of the depth of dependence that you and this person may have developed on each other in almost all instances. One reason for this is just sunk cost, so you put immense amounts of effort in, you've sacrificed and given up on many opportunities. For example, potential ins for other relationships, job offers, small sacrifices like spending the evening with them when you had other things you might have wanted to do, etc. And you have been less in contact with your friends, so you don't want all of these things that you have done to be in vain, and as a result, you try to retroactively justify your decisions by staying in the relationship, even when you know that it is doomed or it's bad for you. Because leaving would be acknowledging the fruitlessness of the last years of your life. Second, fear of the unknown. So even if you're unhappy in the relationship, you know what it's like to be in the relationship. It is comfortable, it's known, and you haven't been single in a very long time. The unknown of all of that is intensely scary. You think that even though the relationship might be bad or not great, being alone must be worse, and you're scared of the possibility of it being worse. Third, breaking up itself is quite painful. You feel guilty and sad for causing someone you probably still care immensely about this much pain. You know that you will feel sad about breaking up. You know or think that you will miss them in the long run. And you feel all of this preemptively. And as a result, you wish for and try to force things to be different when maybe they can't be. Second, obviously, the depth of dependence compounds these factors. So financial reliance may mean it is literally infeasible for you to leave the relationship. Emotional dependence and isolation makes you afraid of life without them. And their level of integration into your life makes this even more difficult. So you have more people that you have to justify this decision to, etc. The setup for the post-relationship period, though not something I'll talk about particularly in depth here, is worth noting as something that matters, because there is a very real chance of financial or psychological instability in the aftermath of a relationship. And so setting up the post-relationship period is something that is worth considering in some debates. Okay, this gives us all of the tools to impact and weigh effects on all three areas. So first, why might entering a relationship plausibly be more important than other areas? At least three reasons. The first is just because it is easier to intervene before a relationship begins. Other phases have an inertia which is difficult to work against, and so it is far easier to just ensure that people enter into good relationships in the first place more often than it is to intervene in bad relationships. Second, this is logically prior to other phases, so there is no real reason to sustain relationships unless we enter into good ones in the first place. Third, it is difficult to make good judgment, and as a result, it is therefore important to intervene in this situation. So, for example, to promote relationships formed in ways that lead to healthiness, but also because you are uniquely vulnerable at this stage to the extent that you have the least information and are willing to make the largest sacrifices. And so making sure that people don't put themselves in particularly bad situations is very important. On the flip side of this, you can also say that because it is so difficult to make good judgment, this is the most difficult stage to intervene in. It is difficult to get people to make rational decisions because this is inherently an irrational part of the relationship process. Second, during the relationship, why is this plausibly the most important? The first is just that it is the largest impact. So these are the things that compound day to day over time and can effectively be, in some instances in which they bug you in a small way over a long period of time, akin to the sort of torture where you slowly drip a small amount of water on someone uncomfortably over an extended period of time. Whether or not communication happens properly affects the healthiness of the relationship in the long run, can affect your later life as well if it goes particularly poorly, and so the impacts of this are just particularly huge. Second, logical priority. If we can ensure that relationships are healthy after the fact, then there is no need to be particularly interventionist in regards to the relationships that are entered, or for people to be able to smoothly leave those relationships. Third, it is just difficult to make changes to the relationship at this stage, and therefore it is important that we intervene so that people can make the necessary changes more easily. Why might leaving the relationship be the most important phase? The first reason is just because it is intensely difficult to do this, so it is particularly important to intervene to allow people out of relationships where they might be suffering from extreme sunk cost fallacy and stuff like that. Second, there's just the largest potential for harm and therefore the largest impact via mitigating awful harms of abusive relationships that get worse over time. Okay, abusive relationship section. Generally, it's worth noting that the vast majority of motions to do with relationships do not create abusive relationships. Rather, in some instances, they foster the conditions that can lead to people having bad communication, which leads to spirals, which over a long period of time could in some instances lead to abusive relationships, or sometimes they make it more or less difficult for people to leave those relationships, or they might make it harder or easier to hide abuse, this sort of thing. Make sure, especially since this is a very sensitive topic, that you're being nuanced about the arguments you're making. The first thing worth noting is just that the healthiness of relationships is not a constant. Relationships which both parties wish to keep as healthy can slide into unhealthiness if communication is not prioritized or partners aren't self-aware. So small frustrations often become larger conflicts when they are not named early, especially when partners fail to notice what bothers them, explain it clearly, or address it before resentment accumulates. And at that point, conversations that could have been collaborative often turn to a more adversarial nature. It becomes far easier for relationships to get worse than it is for them to get better, because it is quite difficult to combat that sort of thing. It changes your perception of the partner. You preemptively safeguard in the instance where this sort of thing occurs, and it is difficult to build back up the sort of deep trust and belief in your partner that is required for very healthy relationships. Abusive relationships are particularly hard to leave. There are many reasons for this. The first is just that abusers frequently socially isolate victims to the extent that it is difficult to reach out to people because you may have been told that they're out to get you. You may just be cut off from them as a result of your abuser doing this sort of thing. Second, you're often gaslit into not believing your own perspective. You're told that you're wrong, you're overreacting, that it's not that deep, that all of these things that you believe are plausibly abuse or plausibly not abuse are non-abusive of your partner. Third, you're frequently financially dependent on your partner. For very obvious reasons, abusive partners have strong incentives to induce some form of dependency, and for similar reasons, you're frequently emotionally dependent on your partner, especially in the instances in which you are socially isolated to the extent that you have no one else to talk to. This is a person you confide in, and even if they are bad to you and awful to you, it's still the person who you process your emotions to, who you're deeply emotionally invested in. Fifth, you might find ways over the long term to rationalize your abuse, which might decrease your want to get help in the first instance because you feel as though you deserve it, or maybe you think over the long term you figure out ways to convince yourself that it isn't a pattern of abuse, it's something else entirely, or it's not actually abusive. Sixth, you might feel like a duty to fix your partner. Seventh, you might believe that you are powerless to stop abuse as a result of learned helplessness. Eighth, you may always believe that you're on the verge of changing the relationship and making it a non-abusive relationship. Ninth, all of the standard barriers to leaving a relationship obviously exist. So, for example, sunk cost. You have frequently spent lots of time and money and emotional bandwidth invested in this person, and you don't want to leave them. You don't want those experiences to be justified. Frequently, it can be even more intense in these instances because you have done so much emotional justification for you staying in the relationship that as you go on, it's sort of a justification sunk cost fallacy where you continue to justify and you cannot override all of those years of justification for it. 10th, even when victims leave abusive relationships, they unfortunately often return as a result of resource constraints, fears about child custody, post-breakup depressive spirals, post-breakup loneliness, and maybe nostalgia or romanticizing the relationship that you are in because you feel bad and depressed now. Most of these will be true on either side of most motions. The primary difference in most relationship debates is how exposable abusive relationships are. So, how much external actors like police, like friends, like therapists, etc. will be able to see that abuse is happening, will be able to intervene in the situations. You can also sometimes make marginal but impactful arguments as to how easy it is to induce dependency on either side, or maybe leave in the least bad case instances. On that very, very happy note, that's all for today's workshop. I'll catch you tomorrow. Quick content warning before I get into this workshop. I will mention abuse at multiple different points. So just a warning that will be in here. Okay, let's begin with the workshop. Parenthood itself is difficult, it's stressful, and very frequently it is financially ruinous. You give up large portions of your life and income-making capacity to prioritize the unreturning needs of your child. Your child costs intense sums of money, estimated to be between $300,000 and $414,000, according to Google's AI overview, between birth and age 18. The literal process of having a child is intensely painful and difficult by itself. Pregnancy is particularly intense. Mood swings, painful bowel movements, morning sickness, that is nausea or vomiting, which can, despite its name, happen at any point during the day, and permanent bodily distortions. Childbirth is intensely painful and traumatic. For many women, it is the most painful individual experience you'll have ever gone through. And unfortunately, many people just don't have access to good quality prenatal care, whether it's because it is just cost more costly than you can afford, or you're geographically not proximate to it. And so for many people, pregnancy itself is a particularly horrifically intense period of time that is traumatic, painful, stressful, and horrible. Caring for the child is difficult. You frequently cannot sleep because of constant disruptions for weeks on end. Postpartum depression, that is, feelings of intense sadness, anxiety, despair, and guilt, frequently accompanied by things like appetite loss, intrusive fears, and an inability to enjoy or feel connected to your child, is something that affects a large number of people. Why does this occur? Well, one reason is just hormonal changes. So estrogen and progesterone rise dramatically during pregnancy and then fall precipitously afterwards. And normally this is not fine, but mostly okay for most people. But some people are particularly sensitive to this. A second reason is just sleep disruption. Proper sleep is very obviously necessary for the prefrontal cortex to be able to regulate things like fear, irritability, or impulses. And sleep deprivation also makes anxiety feel far more intense and acute, and it turns things that would normally stress you mildly into existential battles. And pregnancy and the immediate aftermath are intensely stressful and prevent you from having good sleep for weeks to months on end. And as a result of these and definitely more factors, around 1 in 8 mothers deal with very intense postpartum depression. Psychologically, it is quite difficult for you. You are constantly bombarded by people on Instagram's idealized portions of their life with their child because people only post the positive, not the negative. And so you constantly compare yourself to these unrealistic standards that people aren't actually living. Your child is frequently verbally abusive, and this stings intensely because you see a reflection of yourself in them. They constantly do things that put themselves in danger. They never act according to your wishes. You constantly always fear losing them, and when you voice that fear, it frequently drives them away from you rather than getting them to act in the way that prioritizes their own well-being. You have to balance work and raising a child, which makes both considerably more difficult, which means you are more stressed in the workplace. It means you never feel like you're spending enough time with your child because you always have to make trade-offs and it never feels like enough. Or alternatively, you give up on your aspirations. You throw out any shot at moving out the corporate ladder and you take years off of work as your skills rust and your connections slowly dissipate. You open yourself up to the intense and immense fear of losing them or them losing you. Your time with your friends and family is now constrained as a new variable that is heavily time demanding has entered into your life, and so you lose slowly over time these deep connections that you had prior. And yet, despite all of this, we still have children anyways. Why? One reason is just very obviously many people don't have a choice in access to contraception, family norms which would ostracize you if you used contraception, a new way of laws that is preventing people's access to contraception. In many instances, this looks like teenage pregnancies where you just maybe don't have the financial capital to get an abortion or something like that. Why might teenage pregnancies be particularly bad? The first reason is just it's prior to your adult formulation of yourself. So you're making choices that your future self could never opt into. It is a premature choice to make. Very obviously, you haven't fully developed your brain. Many other reasons that this is probably a choice that is made in not the best of contexts. Second, relationships that are at this age just have a higher chance of falling through. Statistically, they are far more likely to not actually end up in people having long-term romantic relationships with one another. Very frequently, at least one parental figure in teenage pregnancies is never in the picture in later life. Third, obviously, it is ruinous for educational attainment. Balancing your educational life becomes impossible. College is frequently pushed off of the table if it was a consideration beforehand, which means you decrease your social mobility and your ability to climb economically. That was redundant. And the fourth thing is just resultantly of all of these things, there's an increased rate of abuse for children that are born to teenage pregnancies because you feel like this child fucked up your life intensely, that maybe you didn't want them in hindsight, that maybe you made a bad choice and they're the embodiment of that bad choice, and as a result, the chances of children being abused just rise, unfortunately. The second reason that people might have children regardless is just social indoctrination. So for many people, it is just what you do. You plan your life around the fact that you will have a child in your mid to late 20s. You establish this expectation early on in relationships. You find relationships with people who share this expectation with you. As you grow up, everyone around you begins to settle down and have children. You feel like the odd one out if you are not doing this. They oftentimes implicitly pressure you and make jokes at the dinner table. When are you going to have a kid? That sort of thing. It feels very bad to be the odd one out in these situations because frequently this is your entire social group, this is your entire family, this is like your extended family as well, and it feels bad to be the last person in a relationship with a child in later life. A third reason is just misweighting of your impacts. That is, very frequently, you don't understand the intensity of pains that are associated with having children. Many of these pains are not talked about by your family and friends because they're a taboo, or because they just don't fit into the sort of glamorized picture that we post of ourselves on social media when we do decide to have a kid. And frequently, if conversations do happen, it's far too close to the point of having a child to actually go back and make different decisions. So, for example, it might look like your mother saying, "Are you prepared for this horrific thing that I had to deal with at the baby shower in anticipation of the child that is currently in your belly?" Very frequently, the media overfocuses on rosy pictures of parenthood, and so you just literally don't necessarily know about the harms that might be as a result of this. It's also worth pointing out that there may be some amount of adverse selection in having children. That is, the people who know the most about the harms or correctly weigh them are less likely to have children because the harms are pretty intense. So those who have children are, on balance, more likely to be surprised by many of the factors of child rearing that they didn't expect that surprised them, unfortunately. And this results in, unforeseen problems for them, which leads to increased stress levels as things don't go according to their preconceived plans or their notions. And frequently, this can result in potentially ruinous failures in your adulting. It can look like taking out the fact that many different things came up that you didn't expect to come up on the kids themselves, taking out the associated stress and that sort of stuff. And unfortunately, that is just a truth of having children. The fourth reason is just that having children is legitimately quite positive for many people. So I don't want to underweight the sort of positives of it because they are very real too. You see yourself in the child, you get emotional and psychological satisfaction from their success because you feel as though it is your success, both in the sense that you contributed to it, but also in the sense that it feels like literally things that you maybe wanted to do as a kid and you've cast yourself onto your child and that sort of thing. Having a child is frequently a process of self-discovery. You see yourself reflected in them in legitimately enlightening ways that maybe you didn't realize would come up prior. You get immense joy when they are happy or from helping them be happy when they aren't happy. So either way, actually, it is quite good and enjoyable for you. They are a second chance to live out your own aspirations in life. You can teach them how to do the things that you failed to do, but better. And all of this feels particularly emotionally fulfilling. It is also just true that your emotions are bound up pretty intensely in them. So when they succeed, you feel completely elated by the fact that they are succeeding because they are emotion heighteners, because you put so much of yourself in this person that the returns pay dividends. Additionally, having children ensures a legacy. It gives you someone to pass your skills, your money, your experience, your stories to, someone to keep you alive long after you're dead, and hopefully maybe even continue to do so into the future. Third, evolutionarily, we obviously have a drive towards this. There is just an evolutionary need for offspring, and that means that over time we have derived a sort of emotional weight towards them in line with evolutionary inclinations to push us to have as many offspring as possible, because obviously that is good for the survival of the species. Within limits, very obviously, because having too many offspring is like you don't have enough time to take care of them. Fourth, they often provide you social mobility and physical capital. Children represent a chance at social mobility for the people who are past their prime in life. Sometimes they represent a sort of income insurance, the point that you are growing old and incapable of working, and so they represent the sole income source that you might have in later life if you weren't able to save up well, if the economy goes to crisis or whatever. If you work on a farm, it may just be the case that you need more hands, and so having children can just be sort of an expectation in many situations, because you know you need more labor, and that is just a way of bringing more labor into this world. Okay, so those are all of the downsides and positives of having children, and the primary reason that I paint them out for you is just to give you weapons to use in any round where maybe you decrease the number of people who have children or increase the number of people who have children, and to paint out the sort of decisions around this that may exist, because very frequently debates around relationships, but parenting as well, are about the decision calculus that you make when it comes to having a child or not having a child, and the effect that certain narratives or things like that have on them. Let's talk then about child abuse, because this is one of the other most important realms of parenting debates. So what drives parental abuse? First, it might be just this is normal or a perception of doing it for the child sort of sense. Frequently, parental abuse is a result of a cycle of abuse. Their parents physically punished them in childhood, and so they see this as the normal thing to do in response to children's transgressions. Their parents may have controlled them through fear, so they assumed that this is the right way or normal way of controlling a child's actions, and so they continue the cycle that their parents started or continued. Additionally, you may just feel as though if you don't physically punish your child, they won't get the severity of the actions that you don't condone, and so you just default to physically punishing your child because it clearly demonstrates the severity of the things that your child did. Second, sometimes this looks like trauma and seeing the child as traumatic or a living reflection of trauma that was given to you at some point. So domestic abuse, for example, frequently spills over onto children because they are seen as a reflection of the other partner. And this is true for both the abuser and the abused, because you might grow worried that your child might hate, emotionally manipulate, or physically abuse you as well, and so you act preemptively. And frequently this is self-fulfilling to the extent that it pushes the child away, creates cycles of abuse between parent and child, and that sort of stuff. But also just to the extent that domestic abuse is frequently something that happens around you, and this form of abuse is often not targeted or just has spillover effects. Take, for example, your dad coming home drunk and just swinging out and lashing out at the people in the house, or parents who are screaming at each other while you're crying in your room, overhearing it, feeling the intense emotions at play, and not understanding what is going on, feeling confused, feeling hurt by the fact that these two people who are supposed to love each other and love you are at intense odds with one another. I think also children are frequently used as tools of coercion, so frequently this looks like walking out of the house with a child as a way of manipulating your spouse. It may just be the case that in arguments children frequently come up. There are frequently power dynamic grabs on children. They are used as pawns in games of abuse and coercion, and that is an unfortunate fact. Additionally, children frequently trigger your own childhood trauma. So, for example, if you see your child crying, you may not be consciously aware that you have a particularly strong emotional response to this, but your brain has internalized lessons from you being beaten, controlled, or humiliated in your childhood that lead you to do the same here. Or the intense emotional trauma leads you to overreact to the situation and just kind of lash out because you are freaked out by this thing that your parents reacted horribly to, and you still have that intense emotional feeling tied up in that. A third reason is just that parenthood is stressful and people do snap under pressure. This is obviously particularly true for fiscally stressed, that is, low-income households, where frequently things are more stressful because the question of whether or not you'll be able to eat tomorrow is maybe on the table or a week down the line or something like this. Parents may also just have a bad understanding of the emotional development of their child, not realizing what is realistically under their control and punishing them frequently for things that are outside of their control based on the developmental stages that they're at. Or alternatively, you may be upset that childhood, even if it is going all right, doesn't live up to your rosy, media-formed expectations of it, and you take that out on your children. Third, you experience your child as an extension of yourself, so anytime that they screw up, you see it as a reflection of your own failings, which leads to emotional injury for you and over-the-top reactions. Fourth, I think we have an overly adult perspective of how adults function, but many adults are not highly emotionally intelligent. Many people just literally cannot manage their anger, their shame, or their other negative emotions, and they let these things spill out on those around. And because you spend so much time around your parents, that means that they unfortunately spill out on you. Frequently the time that you spend around your parents is the time that they are most stressed, so that they come home from a hard day at work and they disliked something that their boss did, and so they take it out on you because they're bad at emotional regulation and thinking through and dealing with their emotions. What creates the conditions where you have a capacity for abuse? First, it's worth pointing out that for many children this can feel normal and not be exposed till years way later in your life, if at all, because you're not exposed to other forms of caretaking, you're not exposed to other forms of child rearing, and so at the point that your dad smacks you, this is probably not something you talk about all that much with your friends because you feel shame around it, because maybe your dad says not to do that in some instances, and so as a result, frequently you just don't have an outside perspective that tells you that the things that you are going through are not just normal things for a child to be going through. Second, this is a highly stigmatized topic that is legitimately quite difficult to talk about. You need a deep level of connection to feel even remotely open to opening up about this in the first place. You don't want to dampen the mood of your friends when you're hanging out with them, and so you don't bring this up until you have a deep level of connection with someone, or you feel as though you're in a completely safe space where the expectations are already there. And frequently these conditions just don't come up for extended periods of time, if at all, in someone's life. And frequently you can get in the habit of bottling up these thoughts. And so you go, well, I've managed this so far in my life. There's no reason for me to talk about it now. No reason to tell people and weigh them down with my own emotional baggage and trauma. Third, frequently there is dependency and the associated fear that comes with dependency. So even if you hate your parents because they are abusive to you, you still rely on them for housing, for food, and for things like that. And you're deeply afraid that if you let out the fact that they are abusing you, that the abuse will get worse because you probably expect accountability mechanisms to not actually work out, and because the abuse feels the most proximate to you, and B, that the dependency that you have on your parents will be weaponized against you. And that's an intense fear, even if it is not the most rational fear in some cases. And finally, people just believe parents far more than they believe children. So it is quite easy for parents to get away with this sort of thing, even when their children talk about it to other children, because frequently you hear about this through secondary pathways. That is, your child talked to their child, which told your child about their abuse. And so you frequently question the narrative. You wonder if it is legitimate. Even if you hear it directly from the child's mouth, you may not credit it as much as the parents if you're friends with them and have preformed social connections and that sort of stuff. So what mechanisms exist to prevent abuse in childhood? The first is just that it is always worth remembering that things which support financial stability during your upbringing, that is paid leave, affordable childcare, food assistance, etc., are all things that decrease the likelihood of abuse occurring by preventing the sort of stressful scenarios that lead to cycles of lashing out in the first place. Similarly, things that increase parents' awareness of what the process of parenthood will realistically look like reduce the number of abusive relationships formed over things not living up to the expectations that the parents had. Second, Child Protective Services. I unfortunately didn't have the time to look into how exactly Child Protective Services operates, but they're definitely a pretty flawed organization. I think the primary concerns that come up the most regarding them are just pretty intense racial discrimination, and also frequently the traumatization of children during the Child Protective Services processes. Third, children can be made aware of the sorts of things that are abusive. So, for example, what emotional abuse looks like, the difference between safe and unsafe touch. Spaces can be created for trusted adults, etc. And so these things can raise children's awareness of what abusive processes might look like so that they can keep an eye on their friends, so that they can understand the situations that they go under and that sort of thing. Childhood is incredibly important as well. It is a very formative period of your life. You are developing both psychologically and socially, and therefore, one, you are malleable in a way that you will not be in your later life, and two, childhood can deeply constrain your perspective later in life. A number of factors are worth considering here. First, trauma. Trauma affects how you approach things like relationships in later life. So, for example, you might have a lack of trust in your relationships if your ones with your parents were rather traumatizing. You might constantly search for parental approval in life partners. You might have reversion to what is comfortable in close relationships. That is what you got used to in childhood, the sort of traumatic cycles that you existed in under your parents. You frequently have intense abandonment fears if your parental figures left or were not particularly ruly at being at places on time or coming to events that you cared about and that sort of thing. You learn things that are difficult to shake in childhood, like whether or not it is safe to be close with others, to ask for your needs to be met, etc. Early relationship-based emotional development becomes habitual over the course of childhood and is extremely difficult to move away from after childhood. Frequently, because of the imperfect nature of our memory, we have no clue that we are acting in the way that is influenced so intensely by our past, so it is difficult to safeguard against these tendencies, to become aware of them in the first place, and to act against them. Additionally, socially, childhood informs us of what is normal. You internalize beliefs you are commonly exposed to. You formulate your understanding of the world based on the way that people around you act. If you are commonly exposed to the same set of people consistently, they have far overweighted influence on this sort of thing. Your social dispositions rather obviously are not formed at birth, and childhood is generally a process of formulating and honing those. Additionally, children are just prone to doing stupid things in childhood. Your brain hasn't fully developed. Your amygdala is not fully developed, to use a redundant word, but that's okay. Which means that you just make decisions that are not quite the smartest. You don't weight the actual consequences of the actions that you take as much as they should be weighted. And as a result, you are prone to doing quite stupid things in childhood. So, All of these are useful to the extent that many emotions will interface with various different parts of these. So, for example, emotion about social media may interface pretty intensely with the fact that you are prone to do stupid things in childhood. And so it may be good to have a bucket of reasons as to why you are likely to not do things that are actually in your best interest in the long term or even in the immediate term in childhood to address those sorts of emotions and explain how situations that create conducive environments to doing bad things that ruin your long term or are particularly emotionally traumatic for you or whatever are quite likely to actually occur. But yeah, try to think about how the emotion interfaces with all the things we've talked about so far. 2 additional tips. The first is just very obviously, so much in any debate about parenting is up to the specific conditions of the parental structure, how good your parents are, your lottery of birth in terms of whether or not you got a set of abusive parents, you were born into a stable household, that sort of thing. So as a result, this is a debate where you thrive pretty intensely on likelihood. And strategically, this means that reason dumping can become particularly important. Why? 2 reasons. The first is just you increase perceived likelihoods via reason dumping, as I talked about, I think, in the second workshop. And second is that mechanisms in these debates are generally going to be very surface level, because most of this is just fairly intuitive things that are just kind of true and not in need of a severe depth of analysis. And so spamming mechanisms is far easier than it is in other debates, which means there's less of an opportunity cost to doing them. But don't let this trade off with the amount of time that you spend impacting, because impacting is also horribly important. And similarly, you should try to give lots of reasons as to why your impacts are true to make them feel more plausible. The second thing under this is just try to figure out what you can take from the info slide itself. So, for example, let's say the motion is this house, as self-made affluent parents, would raise their children with middle-class lifestyles, e.g. living in modest housing, attending non-elite schools, limiting early access to family wealth, etc. One of the things that you could probably take away from this motion is just that given that they were self-made affluent parents, they probably have lots of connections from before they were affluent. Their family is probably not very affluent or they wouldn't have needed to be self-made. They probably lived under modest conditions during their childhood, and so maybe they know how best to parent under those conditions. Maybe they have lots of friends who are not affluent, who they made before they became particularly affluent, or maybe they just have a connection, more of a connection with non-affluent individuals at the point they become affluent because they have shared experiences, and so they still have lots of friends that they continue to make there. And so you can kind of use that sort of analysis to weaponize arguments in the debate to explain how maybe it is the case that your family just is able to connect with you more at the point that you don't have a particularly privileged upbringing because they understand what you are going through, you understand what they are going through, you can form emotional bonds to a higher degree faster because there are less literal experiential barriers in the way of you doing that sort of thing. As a second example, assuming a middle-class upbringing, this house prefers to be born to a single parent as opposed to being born to divorced parents who share custody. One argument that you can run that is very, 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 very certain is just an opportunity cost argument on Gov, to the extent that, well, sure, you don't know all that much about the actual conditions that you live in, but you do know that if 2 parents share custody, you will spend time going through court proceedings that are just necessary in the process of transferring you from parents to each other, of ensuring that people are doing their due diligence with regards to shared custody. And you'll spend time that is doing things at different physical places, and so you lose access to building up quite as deep emotional connections in one place and that sort of thing. And so you can kind of just take very, very certain arguments in some instances and win on those by explaining that everything else is maybe highly theoretical, who knows how true it is. It's kind of a scammy and not the best tactic in like high-level rooms, but it is something that can work for you. Second tip, just remember how femininity and masculinity interface with parenting. A few examples of this. First example, this house believes that couples should actively decide on and designate a stay-at-home parent. It is probably the case that the woman is probably the person who will be designated in the majority of like binary relationships, not binary relationships, heteronormative relationships, that's the word I'm looking for. Just because like there are intense social norms around this, you already are probably socialized to expect that your career will be the one that is traded off if it comes down to it, and that sort of thing. And so maybe you could argue, and it is also true that on the comparative, like most of the time, like the majority of like emotional care labor burdens
fall on women as well. So it's not clear how comparative it is, and you can make arguments to that extent, but just remember how these things interface or interplay with emotions. Second example, this house prefers a world where the responsibility of child rearing is deputized by the state to communities instead of families. It is worth noting that state policies are frequently gendered because you have predominantly male politicians that actually represent people, and so frequently things like this can just get shifted to women, and as a result, maybe this looks like a particularly patriarchal version of communities being involved as the responsible actors within child rearing. Third example, assuming middle-class upbringing, this house prefers to be born to a single parent as opposed to being born to divorced parents who share custody. It is just far easier. In fact, if you the motion clarification for this round said that the divorce happened at some point after conception, but at some point before the child was born. And so I think the implication of that is that it, basically, in the vast majority of instances, presuming that you don't have, trans parents or whatever, is the mother who is the person who is directly responsible for taking care of the child, who is the single parent in the situation. And so you can kind of make arguments from that. Maybe this is a good thing, maybe this is a bad thing. There are reasons to believe that it is both, but you can make arguments from that sort of discernible fact as well. Final tip, I lied. I said there were two, there are three, is just that, and you won't believe this, the done well versus done poorly clash is important in a very large number of these debates. In fact, potentially more so in these debates than anything else that we've covered so far. And this is a tip that holds true for most debates where this clash is particularly important, but weighing them becomes immensely important. So, for example, if the motion is this house believes that parents should respond to children's displaced aggression with gentle redirection, that is, emotional validation, encouraging emotional regulation, etc., rather than firm discipline, that is, setting clear boundaries, behavioral correction, etc., you can weigh on ease. So, for example, it is far easier to discipline over the top than it is to be emotionally careful when you're doing firm discipline. And so if this is your primary response, well, maybe it is just easier to do this in a bad way than it is to do the other in a bad way, and therefore more instances happen where this is done bad. You could also weigh on capacity. So many parents are unlikely to be capable of responding to infuriated aggression with good, gentle redirection. And therefore, even if in many instances you have the incentive to do this in a good way, you may literally not have the psychological capacity to do so. Second piece of advice here, in debates like this, you have to be clear as to why it is that your analysis on the done well, done poorly clash is comparative. So, for example, given the previous motion and argumentation, the line of analysis that we ran is actually quite bad, because it's not clear why this is true for gentle redirection, but not true for firm discipline. Better analysis might look like you have to consistently get more and more punitive over time as the last measure feels as though they didn't work. On the comparative, there is no such race to the bottom, because each transgression is perceived as a potential learning experience or something like that. And that would do more like comparatively, here's why this is done well, or here's why this is done poorly, and this is done better. Additional fourth tip, so I lied twice now. In many debates, quality of upbringing can be a very relevant impact, even if it is not the central clash of the debate. So, for example, in any debate around decisions with regards to family formation, to career trade-offs, to things like that, you can frequently bring in effects on children as very important. So, for example, if the motion is this house would allow employees to contractually agree with their employer to delay or forego having children during their employment, it is probably just the case that this has a pretty severe effect on when people have children. And maybe it is better in those instances where you would forego this via contract and you otherwise wouldn't forego this for the child, because it means that you are not born into a household where someone is struggling to get through a certain phase in their work life. That's not like obviously that reduces stress and that sort of thing. Another example of this house believes that countries with low natural population growth should introduce radical financial incentives for parents. So, for example, tax breaks for prospective parents, helping buying houses, free childcare, that sort of thing. In this debate, it is probably just the case that the child's quality of life goes up considerably at the point that their child is less fiscally stressed during their childhood, and so you can just kind of impact out to that and make it far clear that the impact here is particularly important. And again, it's a good way of weighing this to explain that these sorts of things that happen to you in childhood are life formulating. They alter the way in which your future life is lived. If your parents abuse you, then you might abuse your spouse. You might do things like just have bad relationship optics going into the future. And so maybe it is just particularly important to prioritize the quality of life of children in these debates, even if they aren't quite as central as, and I think this is a debate where it probably is pretty central, but you get the point. Third motion, this house opposes a pressure to focus on promoting one's career at the expense of forming a family. Presumably on the side that says it's good to focus on promoting one's career at the expense of forming a family, it is probably true that people will have careers on either side. And so if you are told that it is okay to not have a child at this point in time because you're focusing on your career, that is better than having a child and then also focusing still on your career or having your career derailed as a result of it and feeling like anger towards a child for causing the situation to occur, just being stressed, not being there as a parent as much as your child needs, that sort of thing. Okay. Two common debates I want to talk about. First is just on parenting styles. The first thing to say is that tip number 1 is particularly relevant here. So try to figure out what you can take as certainties from the motion and try to explain why it is that you can take those things as certainties from the motion. An alternative good strategy is to focus on the worst case scenario, then weigh on vulnerability. So think about how parenting strategies interface with situations that may lead to abuse. For example, the motion info slide is a free-range parent is one that practices a permissive parenting style which highlights independence of children. It focuses on having unstructured and flexible parenting. And a helicopter parent is one that maximizes their role in their child's life by providing constant guidance and supervision. This style aims to protect and actively guide children throughout their developmental years. This house prefers free-range parents to helicopter parents. It is probably just the case that helicopter parenting probably means that the parent has to spend more time focused on the child. It probably means that they have more expectations for them that they stress over the fulfillment of because they have more of a direct eye on everything they do. It probably means that they are more likely to know about secrets that their child is trying to keep from them. And on the flip side, children are prone to doing stupid things and risky things in childhood, and many of these things backfire. So helicopter parents are far more likely to A, prevent that in the first place because of the fear of being caught by your parents, and B, to manage the harms when it occurs because you're just more proximate in most instances. And so you can kind of weaponize this in either direction to say that there are certain instances where people will be particularly harmed by this version of parenting or the other, and try and weigh on the severity of harms and the likelihood of those harms occurring. The third tip is also particularly relevant here. Again, though, be careful and make sure that you're not giving symmetric analysis. So frequently capacity analysis is just really, really useful for this sort of thing. So taking the previous example, you may just literally not have the capacity to be involved in and all-knowing about everything that your child does, whereas you clearly do have the capacity to allow your children to focus on independence. So you reduce the interventionist burden on yourself. The majority of the time this clash comes up, it has to do with children's independence from parental figures. That is, helicopter parenting versus slow parenting, free-range parenting, that sort of thing. On the side that says that independence is generally good, here are a couple of notes. First, again, children are inclined to do stupid things because their amygdala isn't fully developed. They overweight immediacy intensely and don't even consider the consequences in many instances, which leads them to be particularly impulsive. Second, parental figures frequently legitimately do know better, even though it doesn't feel like it. That is, they care deeply about their child, they have far better long-term planning capacities, and they have far more information than their child has in most situations. And third, on reversibility. In most instances, you have the capacity to reconcile with your child when you are overprotective. You can talk to them about it at dinner, you can talk to them about it in the car, they can express their perspective, you can try to understand each other, etc. On the comparative, frequently the mistakes that children make cause irreversible damage to their future. That is, things like literal crimes, which end up pushing them into awful pipelines, or things which cause them literal physical long-term injuries, etc. On the side that says freedom is good, it is worth pointing out why parents over-worry about harms to their children. That is, you are intensely risk-averse. this is you take two. You don't want them to do anything which could result in them being hurt. You are both hurt by them not listening to you and by the possibility of them being harmed. So you do things like overpunish because it is difficult to untwist these two emotions, that sort of thing. You may have noticed that this is, in fact, a manifestation of the countervailing pressure strategy that I've mentioned so many times. So if you're wondering for a sort of practical situation where that might play out in a debate, here's a good example of it. Second common debate. Who raises the child? Primarily, this is a clash between less parental touchpoints and more parental touchpoints. So, for example, this house prefers a world with family-based upbringing of children to communal upbringing of children. Or elder delegation refers to parents assigning partial responsibilities to their older children and raising younger children. And this supports a norm of stigmatization against elder delegation. Weirdly written motion, but that's fine. The first thing to say is just try to think about the effects on parents. I think this can frequently be twisted both ways. So, for example, at the point that you have more parental touch points, it's probably less stressful for you as an individual parent because you feel like less is on the line at any given moment. You feel like there are redundancies that make it so that you don't have to worry quite as much about your child. Second, though, you might feel bad because you do have, especially for emotions that have to do with communal upbringings, you probably have a deep emotional attachment to your child. So you want to be around them at many points in time. They're your physical work. They're an embodiment of you. They frequently look like you, etc. And so as a result, it may just be the case that if your child is further away from you in terms of their raising, you just feel bad in the instances where they're not around you. And so maybe this is a mental harm that weighs on you pretty consistently. On the side with more parental figures, I think you are generally advantaged in both the worst and best case of this sort of motion. In the worst case, that is because it is far easier to hide abuse when you have a deep emotional connection or intense dependency that you can weaponize against the child. When the child assumes that this is normal because they aren't exposed to other styles of upbringing, and that since it is far easier for abuse to be exposed on your side, you create a strong disincentive to do it in the first place or to take actions that could be construed as abusive. And you're also advantaged in the best case to the extent that the child has more role models. They aren't pigeonholed into their parents' unfulfilled dreams. They have more access to connections, etc. Just pausing real quick here, I want to point something out about word efficiency, because utilizing strong word choice can illustrate the comparative and make clear comparative analysis less necessary in debates. So, for example, it's very clear as to what the comparative looks like in the previous line of analysis I gave. The child has more role models. They aren't pigeonholed into their parents' fulfillment, their parents' unfulfilled dreams, and they have more access to connections. The use of more here illustrates what the comparative is. The being pigeonholed into their parents' unfulfilled dreams implies and illustrates what the other side looks like. So, frequently you can just use good word choice, good illustrations, and that sort of thing to kind of cover up for distinct comparative analysis. Something worth considering. If you're on the side with less parental figures, I think this debate is generally skewed against this side. There are a couple of things that you can do, though. The first is just try to wash the advantages of the other side. So, for example, you can still opt out of the family environment on either side for many reasons through many existing support networks. That is, distant family, friends, school, etc. All of these frequently, especially in the case of school, are specifically designed in ways that allow you access to them in instances where your family is committing some form of harm against you. And so probably in the worst instances, in the majority of abusive instances, there are outs for you to be able to take that you probably do take. Second, it is probably the case that you have far more ins for childhood trauma. So communal parenting, for example, means that one hidden abuser affects a generation of children instead of just one child or two children. And so maybe you can say that the scale of harms that you get in instances where one particular actor is pernicious are just so far worse than the scale that you get on the other side, and that's something you could weigh on. Maybe additionally there is some sort of diffusion of responsibility, so it's not clear who is responsible for doing which things in a child's upbringing, and I think this is bad by itself, because it probably is the case that people will just slot into place. It's difficult, especially under a communal thing, to say that no one takes responsibility for raising this child. I think the better version of this argument is twofold. One of them is just to say that because of this diffusion of responsibility, very frequently the people who are advantaged by society just get out of the loop. It is not an expectation on them to take care of the child. They don't have to do this sort of thing because social norms are such that they are advantaged by them. They have better excuses. I was working on my high-paying job, for example, and that sort of stuff. The second thing is just to think about who might be disadvantaged by the comparative world. So, like, for example, in communal raising, it probably is the case that the most utile children are prioritized. So maybe the diffusion of responsibility isn't something that exists to the extent that it makes it so that every child has a bad upbringing. But it is just the case that, like, because presumably norms will exist that make it so that you feel obligated to help children out, you want to have status, etc., from helping these children out, that sort of thing. And so you focus on helping the most utile ones out because you want them to pay you back dividends in their future late life. You think that this is the thing that will reflect the best on you inside of the community you're a part of because you know that they will be successful. Everyone races to help certain children and other children just get left behind in the race. That is, the people who are expected to be the least utile in society. So this looks like marginalized groups, perhaps racial minorities, perhaps disabled children, and this sort of thing. Alright, well, today's the first day that I'm recording with some warmth, so there is a fan on in the background, and hopefully it's not too horribly loud and annoying to deal with. So sorry about that, whatever, you'll live. Okay, the first thing I want to talk about are the types of schools that exist. So there are broadly 4, this is specifically, obviously, US specific. There may be other types of schools in other places that I am unaware of. But there are 4 in the United States. The first is just public. This is a sort of default for most people. They are free, they're government operated, they're the school that you probably, all odds considered, went to as a child. Second, you have private schools. These are schools that are explicitly not funded by the government. Generally, they're very costly to attend, as their primary mechanism of funding themselves is parental paid tuition for children. But the fact that they are not funded by the government gives them freedom to not follow national curriculum standards, to be somewhat outside of the sort of regulatory landscape of the federal and state governments. Some of these schools are religious, that is, they hold a religious affiliation, and this could mean anything from teaching religious tenets as an aspect of every class to just having a church on campus. Some of them are non-religious, so they're privately funded, but they have no religious affiliation. Generally, these sorts of schools focus on other niches, so for example, maybe college prep or something like that. Maybe it is that some of these schools are boarding schools as well. So a boarding school is just any school which offers food and lodging to students. Students stay there sort of semi-permanently. Third type of school is charter schools. So these are hybrid. They are both private and public. They are free, but they require applications, and enrollment is quite of a difficult process. And they're also granted some amount of freedom from the public school system in terms of the sorts of curriculum that they follow, although they are not fully free from that school system. The final type is just magnet schools. So these are public schools which specialize in a particular area. So maybe it's tech, maybe it's science, maybe it's the arts. These schools are also highly selective and very competitive, and also granted some degree of freedom with regards to the things that they teach. Okay, that out of the way, let's talk about the purpose of education. I think there are broadly 4 reasons that we send children to schools in their childhood. The first is just skill building. So very obviously, it hands you basic, generally necessary skills like literacy, like numeracy, basic social skills for interacting and cooperating with your peers, etc. But it also develops less obvious skills. So reading textbooks gives you pattern recognition and information processing skills, and critical reading skills as well. Writing and receiving feedback on essays leads to better argumentative and communication skills, and the general environment helps you learn how to learn in the first place. So how to take efficient notes, how to research topics, how to study in ways that work specifically for you, managing your organization, etc. The second primary reason that we send children to school is just setting you up for real-world success. Because despite what you want to believe, that representative position on your student board is primarily there for show. Yeah, Mitch, that's a deep cut, I know. So there are a couple of things here. The first is just that it gives you credentials, so diplomas indicate your intelligence and ability to persist in a somewhat difficult context. Student leadership opportunities translate into early resume building that snowballs opportunities in your future, despite the original thing being pretty unimportant in the grand scheme of things. Second, they develop delayed gratification, so studying for a test weeks away or working towards graduation years in the future builds the ability to sacrifice your immediate wants for future goals. And adult success is largely dependent on this skill. That is, you have to save money, you have to develop your expertise over time, that sort of thing. Third, it teaches you to comply with arbitrary requests and institutional structures. For example, showing up on time, completing assignments that you didn't seek out in the first place, navigating authority figures, following a list of largely arbitrary school codes, and unfortunately, this is just a very real necessity in later life in the corporate workplace and university, etc. The third reason we send children to school largely is for moral growth. For example, this is why we punish people for violating the dress code, why you get punished for cheating on a test that is not at all important in the scheme of things. You learn that others' needs matter, you have to avoid disrupting others, that your preferences are the only ones in the room. You learn that there are consequences for certain forms of conduct. For example, again, the fact that you cheated on one test in elementary school is very obviously not a particularly important thing, yet we treat it punitively to ensure that people grab onto moral lessons like this. Third, you build empathy through proximity as you encounter people from different backgrounds, personalities, abilities, or levels of popularity. And this is one of the reasons that it is fairly important to have a diverse array of people going to each school, because this is like the place where you are socialized as a child, where you interact with people outside of your parental sphere of influence, your parents' social sphere, and that sort of thing. And so it's very important to allow people to interact with a diverse group of people in terms of backgrounds, racial identities, etc. Fourth, you learn responsibility. So think things like classroom jobs in elementary school, for example, or kindergarten, where people are enforced to be responsible for certain aspects of the classroom dynamic, or just like responsibility for, your own homework and stuff like this, and group work and that sort of thing in later educational life. Finally, you learn from others. So it is just the case that a large amount of our moral learning comes from seeing how respected people in the classroom behave. Your teachers put on their most moral faces, the people around you try to morally present themselves, and you learn and take in what other people are doing successfully and being rewarded for, and internalize those as things that you want to do. Or you look at your role models as teachers, and you try and do the sorts of things that they do. Final reason that we send people to school, not the final reason, there's actually a fifth reason, is just that the school is a microcosm of the real world. So socialization, deadlines, status hierarchies, social respect, cooperation, hobby building, juggling your responsibilities, life in a community, all of these things are reflected in later life. All of them exist in school without the sorts of stakes that exist, oftentimes existential, around these things in later life. So it's a way that you can adapt to the way that the real world will work that doesn't necessarily have the sort of existential punishment for failing to interact correctly, where you can be course corrected instead of just falling through. Additionally, though, the final reason that we send people to school is just it has a pretty big social role. So, for example, it's just a place to hang out with your friends, but also it's a heated classroom. It provides free meals for students. And this is very important for many parents who just don't have the ability or bandwidth to spend time every single day trying to make meals for their children, trying to make sure that they are okay in their homes, which would be the comparative. And this, to an extent, combats the effects of inequality to some extent as well. Let's talk about that then. Inequality in the education system. First, how does inequality manifest? One way in which it manifests is just that there's overtly different treatment in classroom settings. So frequently, people have their behaviors over-policed. So, for example, black children are just far more likely to be suspended or expelled primarily because of stereotypes about aggression and criminality. And this sort of thing, it's worth pointing out, compounds intensely, because it's really traumatizing and shameful to be expelled from school. You don't want to return. When you do return, you see the authority figures there as out to get you, and you're now in a sort of adversarial relationship with the school that you might not have been in before. And so this sort of thing frequently compounds pretty intensely at the point that it occurs in the first instance. Second, there's a sort of horn effect. So students who show up to school in rundown clothes are implicitly cataloged by teachers as failure cases before they fail, because teachers cast that sort of thing onto the rest of them. They assume that they will be worse in the classroom setting, etc., just because of this one physical aspect about them. And as a result, teachers frequently put less effort into helping this sort of people. Unfortunately, that is just a psychological effect that affects the majority of people and is difficult to correct for. The second way that inequality can manifest in the classroom is just people have differing abilities to engage. One reason is just early childhood before reaching the classroom in the first place. Children enter kindergarten with very different levels of numeracy, vocabulary, emotional regulation, etc., which generally these things reflect your sort of economic status, because children who face things like housing or food insecurity, or whose parents just had less time to devote to them prior to kindergarten, frequently find themselves behind before school has started as a result of this. And that's a pretty disheartening process, because it means you have a more endless climb than most people. It means that you constantly worry about the fact that you're already behind, and this is something that weighs on you intensely as a child. Second, access to things like tutors. This is particularly important for debates around standardized testing, where tutors are instrumental in allowing you to successfully attack these things, because frequently there is a sort of experiential gap which makes it difficult to study for them in the first place, because even though you know nominally what questions are going to be on there, you haven't developed strategies for attacking those questions, and it's quite difficult to come up with that sort of thing in abstract. And so you need tutors who are experienced at teaching people to actually give you the sort of strategies to approach this sort of thing that makes it so that there's a pretty intense difference between the people who have access to tutors, who can afford them, who have the time to spend being tutored, and those who just don't have access to that sort of thing. Second, though, this looks like access to time. So working a job, caring for siblings, commuting long distances frequently means that people who are further away from school or economically disadvantaged just don't have as much time to spend on their extracurricular activities, etc. And school for many of these people just may not be your first priority. Rather, it might be making sure that you have food tomorrow, the next week, and so on. And as a result, there are kind of much higher dropout rates within individuals who just are worse off economically, because they have to focus on these other things, because there is a trade-off in the amount of time you could spend, etc. Fourth, educated and affluent parents are just more likely to put pressure on teachers to attend meetings because they have the time to do so, to challenge placements because they might have the legal fluency to realize that it is something that is challengeable, that other people might just accept. And so as a result, educated and affluent parents frequently are the ones who have more of an advantage in allowing their children to succeed inside of somewhere that may be even egalitarian otherwise. And fifth, it's just the case that schools know that rich parents are the ones that will contribute to their fundings, and as a result, they frequently target their students because they want to make more money, they want to have more donations to their track program, and so they make it so that the people who are excelling are the ones who are prioritized the most, because they're the people who have the richest parents who might donate to them, or they might donate to the school in the future.
Funding differences are another way that inequality somewhat structurally compounds on itself. So how does funding work for schools? Local government funding provides 40 to 45% of the funding for schools. State governments provide another 45 to 50%, and then the federal government generally provides around 8 to 10%. However, in recent years, post-COVID, the amount that federal funds have provided for schools has jumped pretty dramatically. So on local governments first, this is where the majority of inequality comes from, to the extent that local government funding is primarily derived from property taxes. So the more valuable the property in the district, the more revenue that a school receives. And this creates a fairly obvious problem, wherein wealthy neighborhoods sit on or create much more valuable property and therefore generally have much larger of a tax base than poor neighborhoods. Many economically mobile families choose where to live based on school quality, and this drives property taxes up, which compounds everything all over itself. Additionally, Rich schools have a secondary advantage too. They frequently receive much more funding through donations than underfunded schools, both A, because rich people with kids going through the school exist, and so they have an incentive to fund them, but B, you're more likely to feel gratitude at the point that your school district positioned you for success, and so you get more donations from previous attendees in the future. There are very few upsides to this model. The one arguable thing is just that you align incentives of communities and schools more closely such that people are frequently willing to raise property taxes because they know that the funding from that goes to their community or their children. State governments, as I said, provide 45 to 50% of funds. States distribute money to school districts through formulas which aim to answer two primary questions. First, how much should it cost to educate this district's students? And second, how much of that can the district reasonably raise locally? The second question obviously primarily centers on property taxes. The first considers things like number of students, poverty rates, English language learners, students with disabilities, rural transportation costs, and so on. Once the necessary gap has been calculated, the state then tries to fill in that necessary gap. Most states use a model for calculating this that has a basic cost of educating a typical student and then weighs that basic cost by the factors above. So maybe a student who has rural transportation issues is 1.3 times as much money that you now are going to give this particular district. States also need to calculate student enrollment, so some states use average daily attendance and fund based on how many folks actually attend school regularly. Others just use enrollment metrics, so regardless of attendance. Attendance-based formulas very obviously punish high poverty districts, which for rather obvious reasons have fairly high rates of absenteeism. You have to work a job sometimes, you just have to do things that come up more often if you are of low socioeconomic status because you don't have the sort of funding to deal with emergencies and that sort of stuff. As I mentioned, the federal government provides 8 to 10% of the funds. Federal funding is particularly targeted, so you have Title I, and Title I provides additional funding for schools serving low-income students. You also have IDEA, which provides funding for special education services. Also, school meals are federally funded, and some competitive grants are offered wherein districts or nonprofits apply and the federal government then selects winners to receive money. Most often, these grants are used to promote innovation, research-backed interventions, school climate initiatives, teacher pipeline projects, that is, programs that are designed to recruit and support teachers, or magnet schools, so schools with specialized curriculum as talked about previously. Funding disparities exacerbate themselves in a few ways. Two primary mechanisms have already been discussed. Additionally, funding disparities result in teaching disparities, as cash-strapped schools cannot pay competitive wages and therefore employ underqualified teachers, or the qualified teachers quickly get up and leave for less cash-strapped districts. Additionally, extracurriculars have to be funded, and so the fact that you have less funding means you can provide less of a diverse array of extracurriculars for your students. Fourth, things like guidance counselors, etc., are frequently the result, like figures that are not necessarily. I think guidance counselors are a bad example of this because I believe they are somewhat necessary for schools, so I'm not totally sure. But you have many different figures that you could hire to help out in schools, say aides in the classroom, etc., that you just may not hire at the point that you have less funding because you have to cut back on costs, and these are the unnecessary, non-enforced costs. It's also worth noting that just economic downturns disproportionately affect schools that are more reliant on federal and state aid. This is because as funding gets restricted, these places lose access to a larger pool of their money, whereas places that are able to ride on pretty stable property taxes don't fall into the necessity pool of things. School boards. School boards are generally elected, that is, outside of large cities or state interventions. Election turnout for school boards is frequently quite low, which results in a very small but motivated and frequently very ideological group of parents having a disproportionate say over the board. Boards hire and supervise the superintendent, so where boards act as a board of directors of sorts for the district, the superintendent acts as a CEO of sorts, so they observe the sort of day-to-day activities that the school does, they enforce things, they are the people who teachers are directly responsible to, etc.
Third, boards also are in charge of budget approval within constraints. So these constraints are imposed by the states and other power structures, say unions, for example, but boards have a broad discretionary control over how budgets actually get handed out, specifically approving or denying budgets. Boards also have policy-making power, so they can decide district policies on things like grading, discipline, attendance, library materials, student rights, tech use, dress codes, etc. All of these things, the policies within which the school operates, are decided by the board. Finally, the boards get large say over curriculum as well. They choose textbooks, they choose curricula. I think those are close to the same thing. They choose sex education materials, that sort of stuff. Frequently, this places boards as a battleground over what schools are teaching, and you'll notice that the most common people who show up to vote for people who are placed on boards, the people who care the most intensely, are those who have the strongest opinions of the things that children should or should not be taught in the classroom, should or should not have access to in libraries, etc. Okay, let's then talk about some common debates with regards to education. The first is just on stratification. So stratification, broadly, is whether or not we should group people by their academic success, their ability to succeed in the classroom, the rate at which they learn new things and that sort of stuff. Why might stratification by attainment be good? First, it allows instructions to match students' level of need. So if you have advanced students, they're no longer understimulated in the standard classroom setting because they're instructed at roughly the level that they progress. On the flip side of that, and as a result for these advanced students, their skills don't stagnate. You're taught that success doesn't require just minimal effort. You don't disengage. You don't feel arrogant. You don't grow resentful of your classmates and that sort of thing. Second, struggling students are not left behind because you make it easier to target them with things like academic intervention. You make it so that the non-high achieving classrooms are less fast-paced, and so they can move at a rate that is more open and easy to them. Second, you destigmatize academic intensity for students involved by surrounding them with similarly motivated peers that have a sort of echo chamber compounding effect, wherein you focus more and more on your achievements inside of academic settings instead of being bullied for that by the rest of your class who wants to take out the fact that they feel left behind by the fact that you're moving on so quickly on you. Third, you allow some people to prep much better for later life success, so the point that you allow people to move at their own rate, you just do make it so that certain people can access things like algebra considerably earlier than they otherwise would. Things like, I'm using mathematics examples because I did this sort of thing with mathematics, but things like calculus, or just better scientific courses, better literature courses, etc. And as a result, you allow those people to build larger toolboxes of skills before approaching later life. Fourth, struggling students just feel less bad because they don't have students that are speeding through the coursework to compare themselves to. That is, you're not constantly reminded you're behind. It may sit in the back of your mind that there is a different class that is moving at a different rate, but you don't see the rate at which they're moving. It doesn't feel as intense to you. And fifth and finally, you just reduce the time that teachers have to spend on things like classroom management to the extent that in a class that is not in this way stratified, you just have way more time that teachers have to spend on making sure that students who are not moving as fast through the curriculum are caught up to speed, time that they cannot spend instructing because they have to be actively helping those students through. And at the same time, you also get a bunch of people who are somewhat burned out and do things like make scenes in the classroom or stuff like that. Why might stratification by attainment be bad? I think this is the more difficult side to approach, and I think there are two things that you can kind of run and then weigh on the vulnerability of students and that sort of thing. The first is just that there is real and legitimate bias in sorting. Many people, just by their physical appearance, are assumed to have lower probabilities of succeeding in classroom settings, and as a result are frequently sorted down when it doesn't actually make sense to. And second, there are frequently self-enforcing cycles to the extent that at the point that you are put in a class that has less academic rigor involved, you just don't push yourself as hard because the expectations for you are lower. Teachers grade you by a lower expectation and give you worse feedback because they don't expect you to do particularly well, which leads to sort of self-enforcing cycles. Okay, second common clash is on school choice. Primarily, this looks like debates around private schools and vouchers. The primary arguments for private schools are just that you allow people to select into the academic settings that they would like to, and this is just quite obviously good. You make it so that people have access to the sort of education that they want. Frequently, this means that there's less cognitive dissonance between children and their parents because their parents want them to learn certain things, and maybe they learn different things in a different setting, and this is probably just good at the point that you are malleable based on the academic setting around you, and you don't want conflicts with your parents. And also, it's just probably good to allow people to opt into this sort of thing, private market principles and that sort of stuff. Against school choice is generally just the sort of box of arguments that says, A, you defund public schools at the point that you allow rich people to opt out. I think we covered this already to a somewhat decent extent. And so the result is that frequently public schools are underfunded because rich people don't have a very strong incentive to donate to them, and because they're sending their students elsewhere, which decreases the amount of funding that you get from state and federal, etc. On school vouchers. So vouchers are programs which allow students to use money that isn't theirs to attend private schools. In some instances, this is public money, so tax money. In some instances, this is privately collected money, so tax breaks for businesses that donate to a collective fund that is somewhat privately kept and merited out or awarded out on scholarship or merit basis. It can be either of those, and it can probably be a number of other things as well. Eligibility is generally based on household income, specified assessments. So, for example, private things might stipulate specific things that their funding goes to. And up until 2025, this was entirely at the state or private level, but the Big Beautiful Bill contained a provision that includes the first federal funded or federal level voucher program starting in 2027. These pose a constitutional question, and if you want to read more about that constitutional question, go and look at Ava's brief on schools, school choice, and vouchers, which is in the sources. What did the Big Beautiful Bill stipulate? First, that taxpayers can receive a dollar-for-dollar federal tax credit up to $1,700 per year for donations made to scholarship-granting organizations, SGOs. These are nonprofits that will be responsible to issue and manage the voucher. SGOs can grant funds for private or religious schools. They can grant tuition. They can grant homeschooling. They can grant tutoring funds. They can grant therapy funds. They can grant transportation funds, and they can grant funds for other educational costs as well. Taxpayers are eligible if household income is at or below 300% of the area's median income. The pros of this are just, first, obviously this is helpful especially for low-income rural families, or just low-income families in general who face high transportation costs, high costs generally associated with education, etc. Second, it's not sufficient to cover the tuition of private schools in the majority of instances, and so it's not horribly likely that public school attendance will drop precipitously. I think it is much more likely that people will use this tax credit on things that are just personally beneficial for them. On the cons, first, obviously, this does incentivize leaving public school, particularly towards homeschooling, which is fairly bad because of limited socialization, non-standardized or overly ideological curricula, potential for unreported abuse, and probably a large number of other reasons. It also incentivizes departure for upper middle-class families who are likely able to pay for private school anyway, but are now pushed to enroll by wanting to get the most out of the tax credit. Why might vouchers be good? First reason is just that when families have the ability to exit low-performing schools, those schools face pressure to innovate. They need to improve teaching. They need to reduce the portion of spending that's used on useless bureaucracy. They need to allocate resources more efficiently, and this sort of thing. Second, vouchers democratize access to private education, which was largely only available for wealthier families prior. Why might they be bad? The primary reason is just the one that we've already sort of covered, which is just that they redirect school funding while fixed costs for schools remain, which harms the most vulnerable, that is, the people whose parents didn't have time to scout out a private school for them to attend, or the cost difference didn't fix for, and that sort of thing. On curriculum decisions, this is another fairly common debate, changing the curriculum in some way. Most of the time, this is a debate between backlash, that is, the way that the community responds to this, and something that is pretty demonstrably positive for students. Although, you can flip it to be demonstrably negative for students, and you can also, like backlash is a somewhat difficult argument to work out here because the majority of the way that backlash actually works in these situations are either state funding goes away, which is quite difficult to do, or, alternatively, the community backlash is so hard that people elect other people to the school board to an extent that you get like all of these massive regressive changes. But this is very difficult to actually explain because most people's just anger with this sort of thing doesn't actually last until the instance in which the election rolls around and they would actually vote for this sort of thing and that sort of stuff. But that said, yeah, let's talk about curriculums mechanically before getting into, I think, the much better clash in the majority of debates. This is not to say that you should not run arguments to the other clashes that I've talked about. It is just to say that there's one kind of underlying clash which is important in this, and you'll never guess what it is. First, the curriculums mechanically. So federal governments require that states have quote-unquote challenging academic standards in reading, math, and science, but leave the majority of curriculum standards to states specifically. States then set the floor for their curriculum standards, and schools and districts can add on to what that floor is. If a public school does not follow curriculum standards, it may face state-level interventions. For example, correction, increased oversight, a loss of funding, state takeover. States are held accountable for federal government's Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA, so they have a very strong incentive to closely monitor, to scrutinize, and to intervene when necessary. If a state is found to be in violation of the ESSA, they lose their Title I programs that support students in poverty. Private schools have somewhat different curriculum settings. So in private schools, and this is material that you can use for the private school clash as well, curriculum is set by school charter, but it is subject to basic educational requirements. What institutional guardrails exist on private schools? One, their 501c3 status that leads to their tax exemption means that they have to provide public records of school finances and maintain total financial transparency. Second, their board of trustees is responsible for overseeing finances, and so the board of trustees has a direct hand over the sort of financial decisions that are made. Third, if they receive federal funding, even indirectly through student aid, they must comply with Title IX regulations that prohibit sex-based discrimination. Fourth, schools really want to be accredited, which means they have to have high standards for educational quality, which means that you cannot teach completely whack things that lead to people having horrible educational attainment, because this is the sort of thing that gets you unaccredited. And also, there are periodic reviews of these schools, which means that you have an incentive to make sure that you're doing good things in the lead up to those reviews. Make sure, you review well, that sort of thing. Finally, you just require a good rep and image to convince parents to spend large amounts of money on tuition. And since we're a private school, schools have really intensely expensive overhead, and so they really rely on this sort of thing, and so their reputation is particularly important. Okay, back to the curriculum debate. The first clash is it useful? So does teaching this trade off with something that is more important to teach? Remember that there is always a comparative, because teachers do have zero-sum time in the classroom. At the point that they decide to teach something else, or you have zero-sum teachers inside of a particular district, so at the point that you siphon off some teachers to teach specific things, there is a trade-off. It is up to the debate what the trade-off is likely to be with, but remember that there is always an opportunity cost in these debates. Second, there is and the reason that that's important is just because it means that the question is not whether or not the thing in a vacuum is good, but rather, does teaching this trade off with something that is more important to teach than that? The second part that you should always go for is just the done well and internalized well clash. And this kind of shows you another key clash to most narrative debates, that is the way that the thing in question is internalized by people. I think there are three primary questions to think about here. First, is it something that kids will be able to grasp rather easily? They will be able to be educated by teachers in a somewhat easy fashion that they will internalize and that will make its way into their understanding of the world. Second, is this something which reflects community norms or values? And if it doesn't, is it so far removed from those norms and values that people will literally backlash? Or if it isn't so far removed, why is it likely that teachers, and this is the third question, might not buy into the subject they are teaching enough to teach it well? Here are some stock teachers will probably teach this thing well reasons that you can give in most debates. Note that the manifestation of these incentives is an important burden and highly debate specific, and it is also the case that since you are trading off with teaching something else, you have to do the comparative analysis as to why teachers might not teach the other thing particularly well. Or if it's just a debate where you're introducing something that is somewhat shocking into the system, you can kind of run these by themselves. So an example of that debate would be like the inclusion of sexual and violent themes in artistic and literature curriculum. So, some reasons you can use. The first is just that teachers care a lot about their material. That is, you aren't paid a lot, you are presumably highly passionate about teaching things in a good way and helping children. It is why you went into this career in the first place. You care a lot about making sure that your students internalize, understand your material, and therefore you have strong incentives to try and teach it in the best way possible. Second, you studied your material. You loved it. In college, this is the thing that you wanted to spend your life doing and studying, and you want to share this love with your students, and that is only capable at the point that you teach it in a good way. Third, supervisors act as a safeguard. So there is a strong incentive to keep an eye on the classroom, as already painted out, and so you're afraid that they'll walk in at any moment, which means that you don't at least teach things particularly horribly. And if you do, there are literally the safeguards of students telling their parents telling figures that sit above you, and you getting fired as a result of it, and so this is a sort of self-correcting problem. Fourth, if backlash is likely, you are probably aware of the fact that backlash will occur. You need an out, and this gives you an incentive to teach things well to students, to prevent them from complaining to parents, or to have an explanation of what's going on to angry parents, such that you can calm them down in those instances. Fifth, if curriculum change might lead to increased classroom disruptions, you probably want to decrease the ends for kids to be annoying, to cause disruptions by bullying one another, etc. And so you try to not give them the in the first place, because you're acutely aware of how this could occur, as you have spent years probably devoted to this job already, and you do your best to avoid it. Finally, you just care about your job, so you take pride in it. This has been your career for a while. You plan on it being your career for a while longer, most likely. You want to get better. You want to do a good job. You want good reviews, that sort of thing. Second, you want a better salary, so you want to prove to your administration that you're a good, competent teacher who deserves a pay raise. You want to be able to apply elsewhere and have good recommendations for you within your own administration, and so you have a strong incentive monetarily to make sure that this is being taught well, that people are not getting upset at you for the way that you're engaging in the classroom discussions. Third, you just don't want to get fired, because this is a permanent blemish on your career. It is very difficult to find a new job, because frequently that requires moving, and you may not have the mobility for that because you have low pay, you're a teacher. And so all of the jobs in your district, presumably, especially in rather isolated districts, just disappear at the point that you are fired, which means you are particularly concerned about this. It strongly weighs on you. You make sure that you don't do anything that could be construed in a firing way, and so you safeguard against any bad way of teaching. The final thing to say as to why you are likely to do this well is just that you care immensely about your students. You form social connections over time with them. You, a nerd, were probably bullied in school yourself, and so you don't want to see people go through that. So you decrease the ends for this to occur because you care about them legitimately. What are some stock teachers will teach the change poorly reasons? The first is just that you are underpaid, you are very stressed, you don't have the strong financial incentives to teach this well, you probably blow off as much as you can in the classroom because you're a teacher, you're underpaid, you aren't valued by society, you're told constantly by the amount that gets handed into your wallet that you don't really deserve all that much, and therefore you probably don't really care all that much in the classroom. Second, you probably wanted a different career but got pigeonholed into this. Third, maybe you glorified what this job would look like, and now that you're in it, you don't have an escape hatch because it is so low income that you cannot find the time to get a different degree, that you cannot figure out how to get a better paying job because you are pigeonholed into the sort of career that follows a teacher. And so you're bought out, you feel like your life has been a waste up until this point. You just don't like teaching this sort of material. Fourth, you are intensely overworked and likely very burnt out. The administration is always exerting pressure on you to do things like implement better practices, cut costs, try experimental ways of learning, etc. Teaching is a rather thankless job where students are constantly verbally abusive towards you, and the mere fact of changing curriculum in this context is difficult and stressful and leads to you doing your job worse because it is new and unfamiliar. Again, none of these are clearly comparative based on these sorts. Like if you are a bad teacher, you're probably a bad teacher with either thing that you are teaching as a result of the motion. So make sure that you're explaining why certain things being taught poorly are worse than other certain things being taught poorly if you want to use this handful of stock mechanisms. Final note. One piece of advice I gave towards the start of this program is particularly relevant here. Think about how schools are changed by their changes in policy. So, for example, If the motion is this House supports the use of continuous assessment over terminal assessment as the primary determinant of a student's grade, it probably just is the case that schools have differing incentives for themselves, the sorts of academic rigor that they encourage, the interventions that they prioritize in their students' lives, not just the way that students interface with this form of grading. Because obviously if you're a student, your incentives change, but it is also just true that schools and the way they interface with students, their incentives in these situations change as well. That's all for this workshop. I'll catch you in the next one.
Debates around college primarily focus on one of four things. Either they are admissions, so for example, this House would replace all university fees with a lifetime tax on student earnings, although obviously that extends past admissions. One of the primary cruxes of that debate is how many people have access to college at the point that maybe private enterprises are more willing to fund things like student loans and that sort of stuff. Or this House prefers transparent, standardized examinations over holistic criteria. Typically, these debates revolve around who is advantaged by these forms of admission and whether they are good measurements of people's academic abilities. The second sort of motion is just far more common to actually run into. Second, it could be about university paths versus other paths. So, for example, this House regrets the societal expectation of going to university immediately looks like an anti-university round, but it's probably more likely about what people are doing on the comparative and whether or not that is better than university. Third, it could be about campus politics. So, for example, this House, as an Ivy League university, would implement strong political neutrality laws on campus, or this House regrets the dominance of the left on campus, that sort of thing. Or fourth, and probably the least common, it could be about research. So maybe, for example, this House believes that academia should focus on social relevance over academic relevance. Before that, though, how does the funding structure for universities work? That is, where do universities get their money? Obviously, the first way that universities get their money is just tuition. Tuition revenue is particularly powerful for universities because, unlike other sources of funding that we'll talk about momentarily, it's very flexible in what it can be put towards. That is, you can spend tuition funding on basically anything that the university is interested in spending it on. Salary of professors or like dining hall amenities, literally whatever the institution is interested in putting this money towards. But it is also a comparatively unstable form of funding that is sensitive to cultural shifts and demographic changes. And frequently this can be quite bad for universities because you attach the funding to something, say a salary for a professor, and then at the point that the amount of students that enroll start to decrease, you have to make cuts, but it's very difficult to make cuts from this sort of thing. And so that can lead to like sticky situations, I guess. The second thing is just governmental support. So this is especially true for public universities, where governments appropriate considerable sums of money to public colleges and universities. Public universities are frequently used and receive extra funding for programs like ensuring better access to college for state citizens, or workforce development, teacher training, etc. This funding, however, creates political dependence in that legislators can now threaten budget cuts, they can attach conditions to funding, they can pressure universities to do things like decrease their DEI efforts, or change their curriculum, or increase athletics on campus, or change campus speech environments, etc. For public universities, because of the state funding that is received, this is true for both federal governmental pressure and state pressure. For private universities, it is primarily only true for federal pressure. Some state and federal funding can be flexible, but most is directed towards specific things or programs like campus maintenance. Third, universities get funding from research grants from public bodies like the National Science Foundation, the Department of War, the Department of Energy, NASA, etc. These are particularly important for major research universities, where these comprise a much more considerable portion of the funds that the university works with on a given year. This is what gives the N for federal pressure that I mentioned the last thing, as well as some other non-grant federal funding programs as well. Grants are minimally flexible, that is, they support particular research projects. Sometimes they are completely stipulated, and in some instances, however, there is some room for flexibility within the project itself for spending. These save large research costs for the universities that they would otherwise have to take on themselves, or alternatively drop the research. The fourth thing that funds universities is just auxiliary enterprises. So these are business-like campus operations that serve students, for example, housing, dining, parking, bookstores, the sort of campus amenities that you interact with and pay for. These honestly are very marginal in the revenue generation for universities. They primarily serve to make back the expenditure that universities have to put out on the programs rather than accrue a lot of money for the universities by themselves. The final and arguably most important form of university funding is endowments. So donors give money or assets to the university, which are frequently accompanied by instructions. For example, maybe fund scholarships for low-income students, support a particular lab, etc. If this is in the form of money, that money is then invested per the endowment office or manager's decisions. And then the university spends only a controlled annual percentage of the principal value of what is donated to the university. Endowments are restricted in 3 ways, which reduce their liquidity. The first is just donor stipulations. So, for example, 80% of Harvard's endowments market value is legally restricted to specific ends and cannot be used to Harvard's whim to fund whatever program Harvard wants. It has to be put away specifically for the things that were requested of it. Second, endowments are just financially illiquid. Frequently, they sit in private equity funds, venture capital funds, hedge funds, real estate, etc. If you don't know what half of those are, that's fine. We'll talk about that in the financial section. The important thing is that these things are either frequently not feasible to sell on short notice, take, for example, real estate, or have really bad fire sale prices, that is, the prices that you would have to take if you were to rapidly liquidate the assets. And so, as a result, it is very difficult to liquidate these things, and you frequently don't want to if you are a university. And the third thing is just that they are budgetarily committed. So the annual endowment payout already is dedicated to funding scholarships, libraries, research, etc. in advance, which means that if you're forced to spend past budgetary commitments, you have to eat into the principal value of the assets that sit in the endowment. That means the value that is supposed to accrue more and more money off of it over time. But that's particularly bad because it permanently lowers future annual budgets. So anytime you have to spend past the sort of amount that you are using in your budget already, it's something that eats away not only at the things that you can immediately spend on and maybe the programs you have going on right now, but also funding for things far into the future because you eat into that principal value that is accruing more value over time of the assets involved in the endowment. As a result of all of this, it means that federal or state threats regarding funding to universities have very severe teeth. So while it is true that Harvard is rich and they have a large endowment, it's still very, very damaging if the Trump administration threats to cut some billions of dollars from federal funding to Harvard, because it means that you have to eat into that much principal of your endowment, which permanently lowers the amount that you can spend in future years, which gives these threats pretty intense teeth with regards to whether or not institutions are likely to roll over and abide by them. So hopefully that analysis is useful there. Let's talk then about admissions. The first thing to say is just to talk about the barriers to equitable entry into college. For one, college is prohibitively expensive, it is geographically distant, it is frequently a large culture shock, so even in instances in which you can afford, spend the time to travel, etc., it may just be such a different thing than you are used to that it is intensely difficult for you to deal with. Maybe additionally, there is a huge opportunity cost in attending college to the extent that you have to siphon off 4 years of your life in the hopes of having a better paying career afterwards, but this is time that on the comparative you could spend actively making money, helping your family out, making your way up the corporate or the whatever ladder you end up going for in the instance in which you don't go to college. Third, students from disadvantaged backgrounds often attend underfunded or under-resourced schools, and as a result, and these schools often also have high dropout rates, and as a result, they are frequently unable to graduate secondary school, and even in the instances in which they do, they frequently lack adequate prior preparation for what college is actually going to look like, which means you have an increased chance of dropping out of university. Fourth, in many countries, there are just de jure or de facto barriers in the way of ethnic minorities or women entering universities that just still exist. The final barrier that is somewhat debatable as to whether or not it is inequitable or not is just the standardized testing barrier. That is it legitimate, is it good for universities to consider standardized testing scores for admission? This is one of the more common debates, so I want to give a little bit of analysis that you can use and flesh out more deeply than I'm giving it to you here in those debates. So first on the equity debate. I think, one, those with more time and resources get better tutors. They're able to devote more time in the lead up to studying. They're able to take the test multiple times if there are associated fees or long driving distances with taking the test. And as a result, standardized testing does skew towards the most wealthy. Additionally, you have a sort of schooling difference to the extent that certain schools offer better preparation for standardized tests. They're more focused around it. They push you more into classes that focus on preparing you specifically for these things. And in the instances in which you can afford that sort of thing, the school difference that you attend affects the way that you perform on the standardized test, and something that isn't clearly correlated to your skill going into it. However, it's not clear that the comparative is any more equitable. So for one, standardized testing is fairly democratized. You have classes in most high schools that frequently explicitly prepare you for it. Your teachers talk about it in classes where they don't. There are also just lots of short YouTube videos that explain tactics for approaching them at this point. And many standardized tests have fee waivers that are associated that make it so that if you are low income, you can just do the test and waive the fee for doing the test in the first place. What does the alternative look like? It probably looks like primarily looking at grades and extracurriculars, and these are even more inequitable. For example, student council is very clearly not democratized. Many people just don't have the time to do this sort of thing. Tutoring has even more of an impact on your grade because while you can figure out tricks that work for approaching specific tests, you need consistent intervention to do better in the classroom setting where assignment formats constantly change, teaching styles differ by teachers, etc. Additionally, you get the chance to redo standardized testing, which is just not true of classroom grades, and even if that is somewhat biased toward people who are more well off and can afford to do it over and over again, since fee waivers exist and frequently the cost is not hugely intensive, this is something that is accessible for a large number of people, which just means that while your grades are sort of whatever ended up happening, this is something that you can change if you're not happy with the way that your testing outcome occurs. And finally, standardized tests allow for self-correction in a way that grades don't because they're objective and standardized. So data analysis of them and of marginalized communities' testing scores is something that you can use to say, well, clearly there is systemic bias in this particular way, which is not something that you get for grades, because while it is true that you can say that very clearly there is systemic bias, it is individualized in the way that it is done. That is, individual teachers cause this to happen in various vastly different ways between teachers, whereas obviously standardized tests are standardized, and so you can actually sort of move in to correct for the sorts of problems that exist. So potentially they are good for that reason, to the extent that they are improvable over time in a way that grading and the alternative is not improvable over time. Second question, are they a good metric? I think there are a number of reasons you can give as to why these are bad metrics. For one, they're not very good metrics of student intelligence. They cover a rather narrow field of knowledge. They are primarily testing how you do in high-pressure testing situations, which is not something that is reflected in later life, so it's unclear as to how this actually translates into your ability to approach later life in the way that is meaningful after college, that you probably want people to gain skills towards in college and prior, etc. Second, they are high pressure, so you get anxious. You spend time stressing during the test over the time that is passing. You stress about whether or not you'll be able to succeed, get a good score, etc. You underperform as a result of this. Accommodations are frequently quite difficult to get, and so many students with undiagnosed things that would affect test efficacy, say ADHD for example, vastly underperform their actual abilities. Third, they're a snapshot of a single day, so they are subject to wild fluctuations. You may have just woken up groggy. You may have come down with a cold. Other factors, comparatively, aggregate performance over time, which is just a far better measure. However, on the other side, standardized tests are standardized and universal, which means there's less variation between schools. There's less opinionated things that teacher doesn't like you and therefore affects your grade in a bad way. And so maybe it is just good to the extent that they are more universal, more standardized. Okay, given the fairly large inequity that exists in accessing college and that it exists pretty intensely along racial lines, what have responses been? First, race-based affirmative action. You probably know what this is, but it's just considering race as one factor in holistic admissions. This was a dominant response for decades, but it was made unconstitutional in 2023. If you want to read more about that, I've included a section on this that Ryan Lafferty wrote. Why might
race-based affirmative action be good? The first reason is just a signaling effect. So you increase the number of people from marginalized backgrounds who are willing to apply to universities in the first place, to apply to more elite universities than they would on the comparative, because they think that they have a better chance of getting in. This also increases the investment that you are willing to put into your academic achievement, because you now feel as though elite admissions are more attainable. And this has benefits even if you don't make it in, to the extent that because you try harder, because you prioritized your academic success more, you're more likely to succeed in corporate settings. You're more likely to get into colleges, even if they aren't the elite schools that you wanted to, because you probably pushed yourself to be more successful, etc. I think it also just builds good skills. Second, marginalized students are underrepresented in the voices that shape premier research, and this counterbalances that. And that's particularly important for a number of reasons. One reason is just that research has traditionally been pretty awful towards marginalized communities, and at the point that you start having marginalized voices involved, that's something that maybe decreases the sort of awfulness that appears in research. Additionally, though, it is just good to diversify viewpoints, to diversify experiences, to have more people and more experiences able to reflect on these sorts of things that go into research, and so you probably just get better research. Third, you increase competition for underrepresented talent. That is, without this, elite institutions kind of just wait for applicants from feeder schools that they know will get in, that they don't have to do all that much effort for. With this, you have to search more broadly. You have to reach out to under-resourced schools. You have to partner with community organizations, etc. And this is probably good because it builds avenues in under-resourced communities and schools to access elite institutions in the first place. And obviously that's something that pays dividends in later life. Okay, why might they be bad? The first thing is just that students may face harassment or feel as though they don't belong because of affirmative action programs, and notably this affects every member of affected groups inside, not just the people who are selected because of affirmative action programs. You question whether or not you made it into this university legitimately, your friends poke fun at you, it hurts, people who bully you have something that they can bully you with. This increases a sort of racialized and identity-based harassment that exists in these contexts, because certain groups feel left out by this and other groups are then targeted as a result of that. Additionally, affirmative action does not erase privilege, and to this extent, people who are accepted via this mechanism likely will just factually be more underprepared for college than others, and as a result, unfortunately, frequently that means that they get observed as less competent by teachers, by other students around them, etc., and this just reinforces the sorts of stereotypification that leads to the first impact we talked about, and just stereotypes writ large. The final thing to say is just that backlash to these policies spills over to members of the minorities who didn't even attend college, to the extent that frequently this looks like awful hate speech happening online at the point that there is some amount of controversy that is created, and obviously this is quite bad. A few other things that have been worked on. The first is just class-based affirmative action. So while race-based affirmative action was made unconstitutional, class-based affirmative action isn't, and a lot of universities have turned to it as a sort of proxy of race-based affirmative action. I think class-based affirmative action has a number of benefits that are unrelated to race-based affirmative action, but it is worth noting that it doesn't really act as a perfect proxy, because there are just very, very large numbers of impoverished people who are not portions of racial minorities, given the lack of welfare state in the United States, etc. And so, while it is true that this somewhat helps there, it doesn't achieve the same effect. A couple other things that have been done is just ending legacy preferences. So that is not just inviting people to the college because their parents or their family attended the university. Reducing the scholarship funding that those students receive just for the mere fact that they had family going to the university, that sort of thing. And finally, the last primary thing that has been focused is just turning admissions into a more holistic situation. So, for example, reading test scores, grades, etc., in the context of family income, in the context of school quality, your first generation status, your work obligations, your trauma, your rurality, that's hard to say, etc. And so this sort of in effect weights maybe a 3.8 in a highly underfunded school better than a 4.0 in a very highly privileged school. And this is something that is probably quite good. Sometimes you'll get motions about this.
it's worth doing research into this thing, trying to figure out what the downsides and upsides are on your own time as well. So all of these are the sorts of things that universities have tried to do to make it so that the equity in attending university is more evenly distributed. Okay. Second thing to talk about is other paths than college, because remember, college is not the only or best path for many, many people. It may make more sense to pursue a career immediately after high school if college is prohibitively expensive or the opportunity cost is just too big. It may make sense to pursue a vocational school to gain expertise in a particular field that you're interested in, that you know you can get a career in. Maybe your family did this sort of thing so they can help you out by passing on their expertise to you as well while you're going through vocational training. Vocational schools are frequently cheaper and faster than colleges. You enter your career with less debt as a result of this, and with more time to focus on building your career over time, increasing your skills, increasing your pay, and that sort of thing. And so you just get off to a generally better start than you would if you attended colleges. Additionally, they frequently give clearer employment signaling. So, for example, getting a welding certification is far more clear in what it is pushing you to do than graduating with an economics degree, which is horribly broad and not really indicative of the sorts of skills that would enter it. People have vastly different economics programs per institution. Many people inside of individual institutions have vastly different experiences in their own economics programs than each other. And obviously, while welding certifications are things that you will have different experiences with, you know that there's a certain baseline level of competency that is associated with this, and you know exactly where it is that you plan to go with your career. And you know, it is quite easy to get hired in those situations. Third, your associated jobs are just frequently higher paying than they are in universities, especially at this point since universities have become so flooded with individuals that there's intense job competition for the majority of university pathway jobs that doesn't quite exist as much in the instances of vocational training. It's also worth noting that we're in a pretty serious glut with regards to these sorts of jobs. Finally, your job is just more durable, and this is especially important in the age of AI to the extent that jobs that academia consistently ties into are ones that are very easily taken overable by AI. So this looks like intro computer science stuff. This looks like basic research sort of careers and that sort of thing. And this is something that not necessarily will disappear when AI comes around, but AI challenges it. It decreases the need that employers have to hire people in these areas, which is just not something that we are anywhere remotely near yet when it comes to actual robotic capabilities. That is the sort of like working jobs, robots that might take different jobs like those that you would go into at vocational school. Those are just far less developed than artificial intelligence in terms of LLMs and that sort of thing. Additionally, you avoid credential inflation by focusing on competence rather than being a signal of prestige. So the primary reason that most people try to get a college degree is just to signal their prestige in a particular field. On the other hand, vocational training looks like proving that you have distinct competence in the field that you plan to go into. And so this is just sort of a baseline level of competence that employers know is going to be useful in the work field, whereas because of the large number of people trying to get the prestige of going through university, the credential inflation there is pretty intense. And finally, you just address necessary work. So more electricians, mechanics, etc. means more infrastructure development, a better healthcare capacity, more manufacturing output. So these jobs are just frequently more returning to scale than the sorts of alternatives that exist in academia, where it isn't totally clear what the 1,000,000th and first economist actually contributes to society. So, unfortunately though, when there is a dominant norm to go to universities, you underweight these advantages and you potentially misprioritize your friends, your family, your school. All of these institutions pressure you to make choices that are in line with the dominant norm, either just implicitly in the fact that they are doing that themselves and you would feel weird if you didn't take this path,
explicitly because they say that going to vocational school is maybe a failure on your part, that it is remedial, that it is something that is secondary to going to college education, or maybe just like structurally to the extent that schools fund far more and have far more obvious pipelines for going into college than they do for going into vocational schools. And there is a legitimate trade-off as well. First, because political attention and budget priorities trade off. That is, states have limited education budgets, and so if expanding universities is prioritized, that money just doesn't go to vocational schools. And when state flagship universities are treated as sort of crown jewels, whereas vocational training is again considered more remedial or lower tier, it means that politicians just like announcing things like university expansion, research centers, college scholarship programs, etc. Second, because many institutions receive funding partly based on enrollment, and less enrollment because you were enrolled in college instead of going to vocational school just means less funding for vocational schools based on that sort of enrollment metric. And third, because high schools start to cater to university more than vocational schools when that's focused on by society, or what they are judged by institutionally, which means that they give less preparatory shop classes, they give weaker technical labs, and they give less career counseling for trades, etc., that just kind of silently pushes you into the path to university. Okay, let's talk about campus politics. So, we've kind of already covered this, but university used to be a very elite place. It was somewhere that only elite students were able to attend. Members of elite families, members of like the upper class. Since then, there was a lot of government pressure and funding to open up the accessibility of universities, and the result of that is that we created a sort of social norm of going to universities. The government consistently pushed it as the thing that you should do, as opening up your opportunities in later life, and so people just started en masse flooding universities. Now, however, enrollment rates at private institutions are dropping. Why? One potential reason for this is just the rise of the campus left, the association of private institutions as places for leftist ideas, for leftist thought and discourse, and somewhere that excludes broadly the right. And I'd point out that consumer distrust is particularly important for colleges because you have to believe that it is worth it to send your child through 4 years at this institution without being able to check on them frequently in many instances, with the institution having a lot of say over their day-to-day lives, the people that they interact with, the classes that they take, the sorts of norms and thought processes that they interact with the most. And so at the point that you don't believe that you don't trust that colleges are going to do things that are either ideologically diverse, allowing your child to be exposed to a diverse number of viewpoints, or not aligned with your sort of ideology, it is far more difficult to buy into the system, to allow your child to be ideologically brainwashed by this institution that you perceive as just pumping out leftist people. This is a sort of self-reinforcing problem, to the extent that at the point that you stop buying into universities, you stop sending your children there, which means that you lose out on the important conservative voices inside of these spaces because parents are just not choosing to send their children to elite private institutions in the first place. The result is that price sensitivity is just increased as well, and since private institutions consistently go up in the amount of price that you have to pay to attend them, it just decreases your want to be willing to pay that price in the first place. There are, however, a number of other factors that affect this sort of drop in attending private institutions. For one, obviously, the rising cost of attending college just exists regardless of whether or not you are particularly price sensitive to them, and it is more difficult over time to send children to colleges as private institutions consistently climb their tuition fees. Second, debt aversion, because college no longer always pays off, starts to kick in. So you realize that many people coming out of college do not have immediate career pathways. You think that it is more of a risk to go to college at this point. It isn't just guaranteeing you a job, a high-paying career, etc. And as a result, maybe you become more debt averse because you are not sure that you will be able to pay off this debt that your child accrues in the process, or children, who are going to college go through the same sort of experience if they are funding themselves. A third reason is just the weak differentiation between sort of private institutions and elite stratification for mid-tier private colleges. So it used to be the case that there was a large and sort of highly competitive field of mid-tier private institutions that competed for students, but over time, this field is just kind of stratified. So you have very obvious, your elite schools get you basically guaranteed job access. They have very intensely large alumni networks that they can harness and use to get you into places of power to ensure that you have fallback mechanisms in the instance that your first job doesn't pay off, that sort of thing. And so you know that attending elite, like highly elite universities is something that will pay off and pay dividends. But on the other hand, a lot of the smaller, more mid-tier private colleges have just like kind of sort of stratified lower over time to the extent that lower and lower buy-in has reduced the amount of alumni network that they have access to over time, and that sort of thing decreases your ability to succeed in later life. Their funding is consistently dropping off as less and less people enroll, and so there's sort of this vicious cycle that occurs inside of these institutions, which brings them lower and lower. And it's also just worth pointing out, that one of the primary reasons for this is just because it is genuinely difficult to differentiate yourself from the other, say, liberal arts college that exists 3 cities away from you. Very frequently, it is not clear what the comparative advantage of attending one or the others of these are. So frequently, the sorts of schools that have succeeded the most are the ones that have found niches that they particularly fill, that are in areas that became particularly important or sort of timeless careers. And the ones that didn't, the more general, all-purpose schools, just slowly over time drop off in the actual effect of attending them, and this decreases people's want to attend them in the first place. The final thing to say is just the demographic cliff. So the Great Recession of 2008 meant that people were all of a sudden very afraid of having children because they didn't know for sure that the economy would recover quickly. They were scared financially. They frequently suffered lots of cuts to their budgets, and this is not the sort of situation in which you want to have a child. And so as a result, the number of births that happened after that point were decreased fairly immensely for the immediate future. And this demographic cliff is something that I believe just started to hit universities last year. That is the point at which children who would have been born in this situation would be beginning to attend colleges. Okay, back to campus politics though. Why might it be good if this dominance, the dominance of leftist views, didn't exist? The first thing to say is that if you are faced with this debate, it is advantageous to frame the counterfactual as most likely pluralism, but even if it is right-wing, it is probably right-wing views that are not the most bigoted extremes of right-wingism. Many of these views, the most bigoted ones, are just demonstrably false, so research quickly overturns them, academia weeds them out, dialectical processes make it so that it is difficult to express these things and they just aren't felt as intensely in the classroom setting. The second thing to do, I think, is just to point out that leftism is not clearly an a priori good. So it isn't, despite the sort of lean that you get in debate, it isn't clear that leftism is just, morally or epistemologically better or correct when compared to conservatism. And so pointing this out and pushing the burden of proof on the other side to prove that leftism is good is something that I think is worth doing. Okay, framing out of the way, let's get into some arguments. The first thing to say is just that the dominance of leftism has led to pretty mass opposition. So 50% of the world, effectively, now views academia as the domain of left-wing elites, who they are ideologically opposed to. Why? 1, right-wing parties have a strong incentive to delegitimize university. Why? Because if the left is dominant, then output becomes threatening to you. It produces left-wing students who undermine your voter base. It produces left-wing policy advocacy, which undermines the right's policy advocacy. For example, it is difficult to bash climate change when all academics support policy around it, unless you say that universities are corrupt places that we should pay no heed to. And so, as a result, frequently colleges and universities are attacked in political discourse, or they are directly politically attacked, that is, defunding, increasing access barriers, this sort of thing that makes it more difficult to attend, or decreases the ability of the colleges to succeed in the first place. Second thing is just that cultural buy-in diminishes, so research produced is not bought into by the right, which means that researched opinions have less sway on policy decisions, that is, less informed policy decisions are being made roughly 50% of the time, even if left-wing policy decisions get marginally better.
It's also just worth saying that it is sort of a good in and of itself for people to be more educated, yet large swaths of the population are alienated from this mechanism at the point that the right is bought out of universities. Additionally, this is probably beneficial for leftism. So right now, it's not very clear how the sort of discourse that you get inside of colleges is particularly useful. It looks like pitting left-wing parties against further left-wing parties and this sort of thing. On the comparative, you probably get more forced interrogation of your views, so you have to justify your views to more diverse viewpoints, more argumentative ends, which means that you get more precise views. You're more able to explain them to the average person, and this is also beneficial for right-wing research to the extent that you get the same effect for conservative viewpoints as well. Second, you probably stop leftist infighting. So right now, leftists compete with each other for grants. They compete with people who share their views, which gives them an incentive to demonize fellow leftists, to say that they aren't sufficiently anti-carceral, for instance. Also, they are just the proximate enemy for the majority of educated leftists. The literature that you read that you disagree with, the people that you interact with in departments who hold marginally differing views, are people who are on the spectrum of the left with you. But this is a person who you learn is your enemy, which increases the sort of infighting that you get. Why plausibly might it be good for universities to be dominated by leftist voices? First, progressivism is just generally good, especially in the university setting. For one, it recognizes structural injustice that does exist. Things like redlining, for example, have meant that society is deeply unequal, and seeking to resolve this is obviously a positive. Second, progressive concerns in policy target the least well off, those that need structural reform to engage more meaningfully in society, the places where the marginal return for focusing policy on these areas is just the highest. And so regardless of whether or not it is epistemologically correct or morally better than conservatism, it is just true that leftist policy tends to have better returns as a result of this focus. Why is this particularly important? One reason is that you get a sort of progressivism spillover, so students talk to parents, family becomes more sympathetic of leftist ideas. Additionally, though, college leads to places of power in many instances. So politicians, lawyers, but also researchers, AI coders, bureaucrats, people who not only directly shift the policy landscape, but shape the way in which other people interact with the world, have sort of norm-setting effects on society, or shift the way that policy is implemented to decrease the worst harms of it to marginalized groups, etc. So frequently it is very important for that reason. Additionally, though, research on the parts of universities themselves is just like something that informs policy to the extent that research is frequently used in policy decisions. And so the point that you have more leftist research or better leftist research is a sort of race to the top that you get in these settings is probably good for this sort of policy. And finally, it's particularly important in the university landscape. So structural injustices just do shape the way in which people have access to education in universities. You need things like affirmative action, like programs that offer scholarships for marginalized people to balance out these structural injustices. Whether or not these are the best way of going about them is, again, a different debate. But it is just true that structural injustice exists and prevents people from accessing university. And on the side that has more leftist ideology inside of universities, you gain access to the sorts of things that allow marginalized groups better access to university landscapes in the first place. It's also maybe worth trying to frame the comparative as conservatism. That is, there is a natural incentive to regress towards conservatism without a pre-existing dominance. That is, there is an incentive to target rich white students who are the lowest risk and are likely to succeed within the structures of corporatism and capitalism as it exists, and are likely to come back and become rich alumni, which means that over time, there's a constant and persistent progression towards a dominant right-wing influence. Second, though, universities tend to be echo chambers and trend towards some form of intellectual dominance because they have to suck up to university politics, because professors reinforce norms, etc. And so the point that you have one viewpoint pervading university even marginally, that is, the people who are involved in staff decisions, etc., that viewpoint just compounds on itself and makes it the dominant one. So it is just not very possible to have a sort of ideologically diverse chamber of universities. And third, universities tend to be highly competitive, but universities that are pluralistic in administrative views cannot pass university policies as quickly because bureaucratic inefficiency is created and there are time-based advantages that other universities have access to. For example, deciding to apply for one government fund over another. This inefficiency, time spent on internal university political disputes instead of having a harmonized university policy and direction, means that universities are spending more time on this and spending less time competing with other universities, which means the universities with some form of intellectual dominance on theirs, the right wing, have natural competitive advantages that allow them to become dominant in the long run. Maybe plausibly, this is one of the reasons that leftism became dominant in the first place. As a side impact of this, since without the dominance there is likely to be more gridlock in university policy, the dominance is how you get things like consent and autonomy regulation, ethic boards, that sort of thing, to come about in the first place, that regulate the degree to which you can exploit and harm students. Final argument then, it pushes against natural countervailing incentives that exist, so in professional life once you leave and in your homes before you enter. Why is it likely that you're exposed to conservative views in society? And this also answers the sort of echo chamber concern that is likely to exist on the other side. The first thing to say is just that corporate life is individualistic. Bosses and supervisors encourage right-wing perspectives. Most well-paying jobs you want after university are highly ideologically homogenous in conservative ways, and so you're exposed for an extended period of time post-university graduation to the sort of right-wing ideology that exists in society. Second, though, rich white men control most media channels, which leads to promoted narratives of individualism, sort of pull yourself up by your bootstraps sort of narratives, and these frequently exclude minorities, both in the sense that these narratives are just less accessible at the point that you are structurally oppressed, but also to the extent that since rich white men control most media channels, there is just less diversity in media channels writ large. And so, as a result, you're frequently exposed in childhood via media to conservative viewpoints or less progressive ones than you would in university. Finally, intergenerational transfers of belief. That is, general liberalization over time means that your parents are more likely to be conservative than you are, and they have the most proximate impact on your life. They are formative in your original years. They decide largely a lot of the ideology that you prescribe to. And so it is just the case that you are, prior to university, probably exposed to lots of conservative beliefs. Maybe it isn't your parents, maybe it's your grandparents, but there are people around you who have these sorts of beliefs. Final thing to say is just that there are right-wing colleges. So it's not as though you are locked out of education at the point that you don't want to do leftist stuff. You can go to places like George Fox. There are many different right-wing colleges that exist. They're obviously not as numerous as the left in college and academia, but they do exist, and you're not fundamentally locked out of colleges on the other side. Okay, the last and largest section of this workshop is academia. What entities fund academic research? First, the largest and most important funder of academic research in the US is just the federal government. Federal agencies fund research to produce public goods, things like knowledge buildup, basic technologies, trained scientists, health improvements, military capabilities, etc. Yes, military capabilities are arguably, by economic definitions, a public good. The National Science Foundation, NSF, for example, accounts for around 25% of federal support to US colleges and universities. Private markets by themselves would underproduce research because sort of random research has a very high yield. There are three ways that this occurs. The first is just that frequently this research that is invested in by governmental forces is just the basis for other research, but it's not all that valuable by itself. So, for example, taxonomy studies don't really have a standalone value that is useful by themselves, but they become very essential for ecology and conservation later on down the line, after they've been performed. And so there isn't a very strong incentive for corporations to invest in this sort of basis research that other corporations can use to the same ends, yet it is something that is highly valuable in many instances. Second, many different studies just have unexpected outcomes. So, for example, for a long time, some microbiologists were studying very weird repeated DNA sequences in bacteria, and they didn't obviously look like a world-changing medical technology, the question that was being asked was something like, why do bacteria have these strange repeated genetic patterns, and how do bacteria defend themselves against viruses? But it turns out that this was the basis for CRISPR genome editing, which very obviously is something that could potentially turn into a very lucrative industry, but private capital markets just don't want to take on this sort of risk, and frequently, literally no one can spot the sorts of things that will be useful, and as a result, they're horribly underfunded in private markets, which means having public funding involved is often quite good. Admittedly, public funding is frequently targeted towards specific things, so maybe defense, research, and that sort of stuff. And so it is also useful to have a sort of blanket level of funding that goes towards basic research. And this is something that has come massively under attack during the Trump administration, which arguably is quite bad, because at the point that you don't continue to invest in this sort of basic research, you just decrease the platform for which future research innovations can be built off of. Third, maybe it is just the case that you can't take competitive use of the thing that is being researched. So, for example, number theory is just something that cannot be patented and something that cannot really provide you a competitive moat. Maybe to a marginal extent this is not true for like cybersecurity companies specifically, but like that sort of thing is just something that doesn't get private funding either. The second source of funding is just universities themselves. Now, notably, this frequently looks like university to university funding. And we'll get to why that happens a lot in, actually, I'll just preview that real quick right now, which is the reason that this happens, that universities frequently do collaborative funding efforts, is just because the equipment that you use for funding is so expensive in the most like cutting edge instances that frequently it doesn't make sense to have one, say, particle accelerator on this campus and another, say, particle accelerator on a campus a different city away. It just makes sense for them to collaborate using the one piece of investment that one university decided to make. But also, universities themselves fund their own research. That is, they fund research from institutional funds because external grants very rarely cover everything that is involved in research, so universities typically pay some price for most research projects. Why are universities willing to front this cost themselves? One reason is just that research is central to your prestige, your rankings, your faculty recruitment, and your identity. You attract better professors through this, you attract better students, you attract more grants, you get more philanthropic funding, and you get more private-public or private-private partnerships because you put out good research. Second, though, research just supports teaching and learning at the graduate level. Students learn from the literal production of knowledge rather than just being lectured to. And so doing research at this level is quite instrumental and useful in teaching students through sort of hands-on experience. The third thing that contributes to funding is just private foundations. So foundations like the Gates Foundation, Open Philanthropy, etc. These frequently want to solve problems or want to shape fields around their view of how the field should play out, or maybe they just want to push for more support in neglected areas and fill in where governments or markets underfund useful or what they deem useful research. These are generally more flexible than federal agencies, which have to deal with miles of bureaucracy and political oversight and fairly tight restrictions on the sorts of research that they can fund, which means that these entities are particularly useful at filling in gaps where private or public sources don't necessarily fit in. Fourth, philanthropic donors and alumni often donate directly to fund things like a research center or something, and there are varying incentives that lead to this sort of thing. Maybe it's just prestige and legacy wants, maybe it's a feeling of necessary reciprocality, maybe it's the want to influence a field, or maybe it's genuine philanthropic wants driven by empathy or a personal connection to the problem or something like that. There are lots of reasons that this might occur. Frequently, philanthropic donors see universities as the best way of actualizing their research wants, and so they donate to them. Fifth, state and local governments sometimes fund research for state or local problems. So, for example, drought-resistant crops, wildfire modeling, better bridges, things that are local to the state and wouldn't really receive federal funding, but need some level of research to actually get. And frequently, the state or local governments have to be the ones that decide those sorts of projects occurring. Sixth, NGOs frequently fund academic research, which aims to solve transnational problems or fit into their particular scope. There is a lack of funding other than philanthropic funding for and like the foundation funding we talked about a second ago, for problems that are transnational, because federal governments frequently don't care about them particularly intensely because there's a sort of collective action problem that exists. So NGOs frequently have to fill in this gap here. And obviously private corporations don't really care either because, again, collective action problem. So this looks like NGOs funding research into climate change policies, migration, public health, that sort of thing. Corporations also fund research pretty extensively. So firms obviously have strong incentives to innovate, but they don't want to do all of their research internally. Why? The main reason is just that internal research and development is expensive. It requires hiring highly specialized scientists, carefully maintaining labs, buying very expensive equipment. On the comparative, universities already have this infrastructure. On the comparative, hello? They have professors whose careers have been built around the specific narrow area of technical expertise that the corporation requires. They have PhD students and postdocs who literally want, like legitimately, this is something that is beneficial for them, to spend years on these hard problems. They have laboratories, animal facilities, computing clusters, clean rooms, very expensive technology like particle accelerators, etc. This is generally true for all of the actors that use institutions for research, and remember the magnitudes of required expenses, because cutting-edge facilities cost in the many millions of dollars, and this is just not something that is feasible for the majority of entities, so you have to rely on places where this capital is already built up, where the investments have already occurred, so that you can use access to those, and at the same time, decrease the overhead costs associated with that same sort of investment. These partnerships, that is, corporation to university partnerships, are frequently symbiotic. In fact, actually, most of these are. Companies frequently donate proprietary things to the university. So, for example, data sets that might be held onto by the company specifically. And in many instances, these are long-term partnerships. So maybe a company creates a named center at the university to forward a long-term partnership or something like that. They also frequently act as education to career pipelines. So the entities that you partner with give you experience working in their fields, working with their technology, working with their information that they have proprietary control over. And so that sort of thing leads it to be much easier to adjust to corporate life working with the same institution or corporation. Some additional notes to keep in mind. First, overpublishing and underpublishing are both very major problems in academia. Overpublishing is a problem for a number of reasons. First, just academic careers are built around publish or perish. That is, publishing is the main proof of your academic productivity. You're judged by your H-index, that is the number of papers that you've published that have been cited at least that many times. So, for example, if you have an H-index of 15, then you have at least published 15 papers which have been cited at least 15 times each. Second, though, quality is just hard to measure, so institutions have to rely on quantity. Obviously, there are some more objective measures of quality, for example, inclusion in a particularly prestigious journal, but it is generally hard to judge research quality across even subfields. So the people hiring you as a result cannot ensure that the quality of each paper is good beyond a certain point, that is, looking at like the writing style and that sort of stuff, and so they frequently just rely on quantity measurements. Third, the grant system encourages this because funders want proof that money spent produced results, and as a result, grant cycles punish slow, risky, even high-quality workers, and therefore funders have to operate on fixed timelines. And so this strongly incentivizes you to just publish as much as possible to get more grants, to be seen as a less risky asset for grant applications in the future, that sort of thing. And finally, institutional prestige is built on prestige of researchers, so institutions want academics with ever higher H-indexes. They want more and more publications to their name, and as a result, there's frequently an intense institutional push to overpublish. There are a few impacts of this. The first is that you decrease the general quality of research as researchers spend less and less time, as quality standards drop precipitously in a race to the bottom, and as these norms get calcified over time as new generations of researchers who didn't experience the alternative become primary researchers, people who didn't know what things were like when quality standards were higher or something like this. Second, you incentivize scummy and questionable things like p-hacking, especially since there is a novelty bias. So institutions and researchers always want novel, marketable findings. Redundancy doesn't sell or get into journals and is cited by people less. And so you incentivize pushing for scummy and questionable results, such as, again, p-hacking. And just for context, p-hacking is something that can be done in various ways. For example, it might look like adding or removing control variables until statistical significance is found. It might look like running simulations until the p-value drops below 0.05. And then stopping without going any further, and it might look like changing the model to exclude disadvantaged disadvantageous quote-unquote outliers within the data that you're working with in ways that shift the sort of probability that you're able to achieve. Meta-studies are a decent but not always working safeguard against this, that is, studies of the practices that various studies used, which generally look at an aggregate and not an individual paper. The third impact is just that you get predatory journals. So journals that do things like accept weak or fake papers for a fee, which push fake plagiarized, p-hacked papers into citable publications, which enter Google Scholar, enter policy decisions and discussions, etc. This is especially dangerous in public health, psychology, etc., fields where there are clear impacts of the research that is pushed into the mainstream. But it also provides two sorts of benefits, that is, the predatory journals do. The first is just that frequently these journals are open access, so there's no subscription barrier, and that means that people can access research easier to an extent. And second, there is potential to contain valid work that was excluded elsewhere because it was a member of one of the categories we're going to talk about right now. Certain things additionally are underpublished. So one thing that is underpublished are negative and null results. That is, a study that find this drug works, or this intervention is effective, or this variable predicts behavior, is far easier to frame as a contribution to a field than one which finds the opposite of that. So this variable doesn't predict behavior. That is, null results frequently look like non-results, even when they are quite useful. They feel like failure cases, and as a result, they don't get published. But if 10 researchers test a policy, and 9 of them find no effect, but only the one positive study gets published, the field then develops falsely. Yet journals frequently don't publish this sort of thing, and even if you wanted to publish these null results, you would have to go through a most likely more difficult to justify peer reviewing process, but you, a young academic with limited time, probably just don't have the time to commit to that drawn-out process. Second, replication studies are also underpublished and underpursued. One reason is just that they lack novelty, so even if it's in a different context, it doesn't feel important to acknowledge that this experiment from, say, 20 years ago or in a different environment also holds up now or in this new, different environment. Second, though, replication is frequently socially risky. You create professional conflict with the original author who has their reputation at stake in the original results at the point that you publish something that goes against what they said. And they've likely been around in academia much longer than you, given that they posted these results before you. And so this is quite frequently something that can lead to sort of bad power dynamics which affect your career, you're scared of doing this sort of thing, etc. Third, replication is just generally difficult to fund. Funders prefer that you ask new novel questions that lead to new breakthroughs, and so it is more difficult to get grants for things that replicate previously done studies to make sure that they are legitimate. Third, the third thing that is underfunded or underpublished is just slow, difficult, long horizon research. And generally this is because it is underpursued, not because it is underpublished. Much research legitimately does take years before it produces anything that is remotely useful or publishable. So for example, archival history requires you learn a new language, travel to archives, read thousands of documents, etc. Ethnography may require that you spend years in one community, and these just have a much higher failure risk. If the study turns out to be not fruitful, you just wasted years of your life. Another thing that is consistently underpublished is just interdisciplinary work. There are two broad reasons for this. One of them is audience mismatch. So, for example, you might try to publish a philosophical economic paper, but it's too qualitative for an economics journal, but it's also too empirical for a philosophy journal. And so there's this question of who reads, who is the audience? And because there are not that many interdisciplinary audience members, these things are just underfunded and underpursued. Second, though, reviewer mismatch. So peer review, we'll talk about this mechanically in a second, depends on experts. And interdisciplinary work requires multiple forms of expertise, but reviewers are frequently only trained in one method, and so they may misunderstand or undervalue the other method, which leads to a greater chance of rejection in these instances. The second to final thing that is underpursued or underfunded or underpublished, not underfunded, is just research that threatens powerful actors or large donors. And this one is actually underfunded too. And so the obvious reason is just because they're funding you. Like, obviously they're going to threaten to pull their funding if you threaten to publish research that goes against their interests. And this is something that concerns you because you need their funding to do more research, your institution pressures you, etc. But second, access dependence exists in two ways. The first is that proprietary I can't say that word. Proprietary data, records, industry interviews, etc., are just frequently not available to researchers if the entity knows that these things pose a threat and therefore and have control over the axis of the thing. So for example, maybe they have control over the career outcomes for industry specialists, being the monopsony on the industry specialists in this particular area because they're the leading cutting edge firm or whatever. But also in instances where this access is provided in the first place, it gives the entity the in to push research away from threatening findings by threatening to withdraw access at the point that you consider publishing something that goes against their wants. Finally, there's also a backlash overflow. So you're afraid of political or public attacks at the point that you push back against them, some really cared about institution or corporation. And this is something that worries you as well and decreases your incentive to pursue this sort of thing. The last thing that is underpublished is just research on marginalized populations. And the primary reason for this is just because those populations have less funding power to push for this sort of research in the first place and are frequently less involved in academic institutions because of structural oppression. And so as a result, research on marginalized populations is frequently vastly underpublished, proportionate to the returns on that sort of research. Okay, let's talk about the peer review process, what it looks like, and the sorts of downsides associated with certain versions of it. So what it looks like is as follows. First, an author submits a manuscript to a journal. That is, it includes the paper, the abstract, the figures, the tables, the references, author information, funding disclosure, and conflict of interest statements, and probably a number of other things. Second, the journal's editorial office does very basic checks, so formatting, plagiarism, ethics. Third, an editor does an initial screening which asks various questions. For example, maybe, is this on topic? Is this novel enough? Is the method obviously defective? Is the writing intelligible? Is it too narrow or weak, etc.? Many papers are rejected here without external review, which is also called a quote-unquote desk reject. Fourth, if the editor thinks the paper is potentially publishable, they invite reviewers. Reviewers are usually academics or experts in the relevant subfield. They are generally unpaid. They read the paper and they evaluate the research question, contribution, literature engagement, method, writing, and fit for the journal, and some other factors as well. Fifth, reviewers recommend one of several outcomes, either accept, minor revisions, major revisions, reject and resubmit, or reject. Direct acceptance is fairly rare. Most commonly, a paper receives revise and resubmit. Sixth, the author revises. They then write a response letter explaining how they addressed each comment that was made. Seventh, the revised manuscript may return to viewers, or the editor can decide themselves. And eighth, this cycle just continues over and over in some instances until either it is accepted to the journal or rejected. And obviously this differs by field, but this is a sort of general structure of the peer review process. There are a few dominant peer review models. The first is single anonymous review. So reviewers know the authors, but the authors don't know the reviewers, which means that the reviewers are able to evaluate in context to know whether the author does have relevant expertise, whether the methods are plausible given their labs or data sets, etc. This is also quite administratively simple, which is to say that the manuscript does not need to be anonymized. And so that's a little bit of a less large burden on the editor or the author of the manuscript. The primary positive of this is just that it produces more frank reviews. So since reviewers are anonymous and don't fear credibility backlash, if they're reviewing from more powerful actors, they're more willing to criticize the work, which additionally protects junior reviewers who are still working on their reputation when they are particularly influenceable by powerful actors backlashing against them. The downsides include bias. So unfortunately, it is just the case that reviewers will be influenced by prestige, that is where the paper originated from, whether or not the author or authors of the paper have a reputation that existed already. This is just the same thing as rep bias and debate. And for example, you may assume that a famous author's method is sophisticated, while a junior scholar's exact same method is something that is incompetent. The second sort of way that peer reviews work is double anonymous. So authors are anonymous as well as the reviewers. On the positive side, obviously, this means that it is generally more fair because you cannot be influenced by internal biases or the reputation of the person that you're reviewing. On the downsides, the first thing to say is just anonymity is pretty fake. In specialized fields, reviewers can kind of just infer authors from the topics that are discussed, from the methods of going about it, from the writing styles of the author, from grant references or other details that are just impossible or too not worth the cost to the paper to scrub.
Additionally, though, it imposes constraints on authors. That is, you have to remove self-identifying citations, institutional details, etc., which in some instances might make the paper awkward and marginally more likely to be rejected by the reviewers, or, more importantly, which reduce transparency about things like conflicts of interest, because you can't announce the sort of conflict of interest that you probably should announce in the instance in which it isn't anonymized. The third primary way that this occurs is just open peer reviews, so identities are fully revealed. One of the positives of this is that there's accountability on the reviewer's part, so you know that your names will be attached to your comments, and therefore you are less likely to be lazy, to be hostile, to be careless in your remarks. Additionally, open reports can also frequently let readers see what concerns were raised with the publication, how authors responded to those concerns, and this can also be achieved via other methods which keep reviewers anonymous, so it isn't something that is exclusive to them, but it's something that is encouraged by them. On the negatives, obviously this has the same downsides discussed with single anonymous when it comes to the anonymity of the author themselves, or the authors. But additionally, reviewers may soften criticism because they know that their names will be attached, and you might get worse critiques of the material in instances where, again, there's a sort of credibility backlash on the line or this sort of thing. Or maybe you just soften your remarks at the point that you know that you will be known for these remarks. A couple other things that sometimes exist in terms of peer review. First, post-publication peer review. This is very important during fast-moving crises, for example, pandemics or financial crises, in which it doesn't make a ton of sense to hold papers, especially important papers, back behind the peer review process. And so frequently, what that looks like in those instances is the paper being published and then peer review happening afterwards and the peer review comments being publicly available so that people can see them and consider them at the same time as the paper. A second method is just collaborative peer review. So this is something that kind of works with the other versions of peer review, but it's just a method that allows your peer reviewers to interact with one another, to talk about the sorts of criticisms, and it's not something that has just individual different reviewers making their own individualized comments. Finally, registered reports exist. So this is a process through which journals review the research question, the methodology, etc., before the results are known, before the report is considered for publishing. And if the design is accepted, the journal then commits to publishing the study regardless of the outcome. And this can frequently be good when it is a question of critiquing a influential report or a very powerful actor, because it pushes you to not be biased by the fact that you might get backlash as a result of this and publish the results anyway at the point that the process is legitimate. Okay, let's talk quickly about life as an academic. Life as an academic can be deeply stressful. You have to deal with lots of bureaucracy. You have to deal with constant traveling because of short-term contracts, lots of uncertainty around funding, constant pressure to publish, cycles of abuse where your superiors are hard on you, so you think that you should do the same to those under you, perpetuating itself. Tenure, very obviously, fixes most of this, but it is also difficult to achieve. What does tenure look like? Importantly, tenure does not mean that a professor can never be fired. It just means that they cannot be fired simply because of their research, teaching, speech, or conclusions. This allows scholars to pursue controversial or long-term inquiry without fearing career punishments and associated risks, and is a particularly important mechanism for getting this sort of research out there, research that is dangerous to publish in terms of your reputation, because you know that you have a salary to hold on to in those instances. So what does the process look like? First, the university hires you into a tenure track position, usually as an assistant professor, and you're given a probationary period to build a record in research and teaching. Second, near the end of that period, the university conducts a major review of you. If this review is successful, you get tenure and promotion to no longer be an assistant professor. If it fails, then you'll likely have to leave the institution within a year or so. The review takes into account a lot of factors. It takes into account research, teaching, service, for example, contribution to the department and university, curriculum development, student advising, peer reviews, etc., and external reputation and other various factors. In most of the debates around tenure, this is a fairly rare debate. It is not very advisable to run the arguments to the effect of, well, you won't get fired for doing actively bad things to students or whatever, which I think frequently come up. You can run that and explain that, marginally it is the case that your voice is now trusted, that the university risks more in firing you, but it's not just your position is a guaranteed spot that is
I think, the common association. I think it is far better to work through how your incentives interface with having a guaranteed position. So maybe it is good in some instances for the reason that I gave at the top, that it allows you to pursue sort of controversial or long-term inquiry, but maybe it is also bad because it means that you just don't continue to push out all that much particularly useful or good research because you know that you have a spot at the university permanently. Think about maybe the background of your incentives and why they're likely to lead to one of those outcomes or the other one. Think about how stressful it is to go through the academic process to the point of getting to tenure and how much you want to get out of constantly publishing more and more things. Or think about how much you care about the specific topic that you probably teach, how passionate you are about it, and that sort of stuff. Okay, that's all for today's workshop. This is a bit of a longer one, but I had fun creating it, so I'll catch you all next week.